Good evening, my restless voyagers. How have you been holding up lately? I hope the days have been kind to you, or at least not unkind. And if they haven't, well, you found safe harbor here with me tonight. You can settle in, wrap yourself in a blanket, and let the world wait outside for a while. You're listening to Somnolent Conspiracies, where we wander through shadows and salt spray, following stories most people are too afraid to tell out loud. Tonight, I want you to come with me to the far edge of England, where the cliffs lean into the wind and the sea is never still. They say the ocean remembers every sin ever committed on its shores. In Cornwall, they whisper about a night tide so dark it stains the water like ink, and about a lighthouse that bleeds when it comes. Picture it. White stone walls streaked with something red, dripping into the sea below. Not rust, not paint. Warm, fresh. Locals call it the black tide curse. The Coast Guard calls it superstition. But when a body is found at the foot of the tower after a bleeding tide, Detective Eleanor Shaw is sent from Truro to investigate. The thing about tides is they always return, and so do those who vanish into them. Part 1. The body at the foot of the tower. The fog was so dense it felt like walking into wet wool. Detective Eleanor Shaw stepped out of the unmarked police car, and the air hit her with a briny sting, sharp enough to cut through the dregs of her early morning coffee. Dawn here wasn't a burst of color. It was a slow bleeding of gray into a slightly paler gray. Somewhere beyond the mist, gulls screamed in looping arcs, their shapes only briefly visible before vanishing back into the white. She tugged her scarf higher, the cold crawling in under her collar like an unwanted guest. The Atlantic's voice was constant, an unending percussion of waves battering the cliff base far below, the sound swelling and fading with a rhythm older than anything human. It was almost hypnotic, almost. A cluster of fishermen lingered 30 yards away, huddled together like sheep before a storm. Their oilskin coats glistened with moisture, caps pulled low. Shaw noticed the way their bodies angled away from the lighthouse, as if even looking at it for too long might invite something they didn't want. None of them crossed the thin rope cordon strung between two rusting stakes. The locals had put it there before the police had even arrived. She followed their line of sight. The lighthouse emerged from the fog in pieces. First the broad white base, then the narrowing shaft, then the faint ghost of its upper gallery. Up close, the stone wasn't pure white at all, but pitted and weathered, like bone left too long in the sea. And this morning it bore something new. The man lay sprawled at the tower's base, head angled toward the sea as though he had been trying to listen to something only he could hear. His limbs splayed at wrong angles, fingers curled and stiff, palms open to the sky. Shaw felt her jaw clench. The tide hadn't touched him yet, but the rocks beneath were slick, as if the sea had reached out and then changed its mind. What drew her closer was not the body, but the streaks. From the midsection of the lighthouse wall, fresh rivulets of red trickled downward, winding like veins toward the jagged rocks below. The liquid's color was too rich, too heavy to be rust, and the smell, iron, raw and undeniable, cut through the brine. Droplets merged, forming thin lines that dripped over the edge and vanished into the dark water, staining it in soft, clouding swirls. Shaw crouched near the victim, her boots scraping on gravel. "No pooling under him?" she asked without looking up. The pathologist, crouched opposite her, shook his head. "Not much at all. But this," he gestured to the wall. "Typo negative. It's human." Behind them, a low murmur rippled through the fishermen. She caught fragments in Cornish-accented English. The tide took him. The light gave him back. None of them seemed inclined to elaborate. She straightened, brushing damp grit from her palms. The man's face was slack, the skin already cooling, his eyes half open. There was a faint abrasion along the right temple, but no obvious fatal injury. No drag marks leading to the spot either. Wherever he had been before, he hadn't been carried here in the ordinary sense. A gust of wind curled around the tower, making the gulls shriek overhead. Shaw looked up at the lighthouse's narrow windows, empty, unblinking. The topmost gallery was barely visible through the mist, but the faint glint of the beacon lens caught a sliver of early light. Her gaze dropped back to the red streaks, tracing them upward to their origin somewhere out of sight. The idea of finding their source tugged at her in a way she didn't like. Too many crime scenes were clinical, dead in their details. This one felt alive, as if it were watching her back. She turned to the pathologist. Time of death. Hard to be exact. Sometime between midnight and 3 a.m., I'd guess. Temp drop, stiffness. Fits the window. And cause. He lifted a shoulder. Not here. We'll know more after post-mortem. But the blood on that wall isn't all his. That made her pause. You're sure? Positive. Volume's wrong, and his own neg matches the sample, but there are markers suggesting multiple donors. Could be contamination. Could be something else. The fishermen were already edging backward, as if sensing the conversation had veered into places they wanted no part of. Shaw's eyes swept over their faces, lined, weather-beaten, all fixed on the ground. These men had seen storms that tore boats in half and swallowed friends whole, but whatever this was, it carried a different weight. She walked toward the base of the lighthouse, close enough to feel the spray from the sea rise against her boots. The door stood ajar, its heavy wood swollen with years of salt air. The hinges creaked under the push of the wind, and the darkness inside felt dense, layered, like it had been sitting undisturbed for too long. She paused on the threshold, one gloved hand resting against the stone. The streaks of red passed within inches of her face, the droplets trembling before they fell away into the roar below. A faint vibration hummed under her palm. Not enough to be mechanical, more like the thrum of something vast moving far beneath. She glanced over her shoulder at the fishermen. They were already turning away, pulling their collars tight, their boots squelching in the damp gravel as they retreated. Not one looked back. The pathologist zipped his kit shut. I'll get samples sent to the lab immediately. Want me to bag anything else? Just keep the chain of custody clean, she said. Her eyes were still on the streaks. We'll need every scrap we can get. From somewhere up in the fog, a gull's cry echoed down the shaft of the tower. Shaw adjusted the strap of her satchel, took one last look at the body, and stepped inside. Shaw enters the lighthouse to examine inside. Part 2, inside the beacon. The lighthouse swallowed her footsteps and fed them back as hollow echoes. Inside, the air was colder, sapped of warmth the way churches are at dawn. The door shuttered once behind her and settled, and the thud became part of the place's heartbeat. Sea, wind, stone. A single bulb burned in a cage fitting over the entry, throwing a cone of pale light onto the first curve of the stair. The steps rose in a tight spiral along the inside wall. Each tread a shallow arc of worn stone dipped slightly in the middle where generations of boots had pressed the same path. Shaw touched the rail and felt the grit. When she lifted her glove, the leather was dusted white. Salt. The spiral staircase was lightly coated with it, as if a fine frost had settled in the night. It lay along the rail, in the corners of the steps, embroidered along hairline cracks in the plaster where the sea's breath had crept in and dried. Crystals fine enough to catch the bulb's light and glitter like something festive until you remembered what lay outside. Shaw brushed her knuckle across the rail again and listened to the faintest, crystalline rasp. Oceans find their way into everything. Careful on the turnings. The voice came from above, dry, strained. A man stood halfway up, one hand on the rail, the other wrapped around the newel where the next loop began. He was tall but had that folded look of someone who had spent too many years in a narrow tower. Shoulders a little hunched, neck forward, ligaments in the hands showing through. The light bleached him into angles and bones. His eyes were bloodshot the way insomniac's eyes are, the rims raw-edged, lids pink with the fatiguing rub of salt and sleeplessness. He didn't blink as much as you'd expect. Thomas Grigg? Shaw asked. He nodded once. Keeper. Eleanor Shaw, she said, lifting her warrant card as she climbed. Sid. He didn't look at the card, just at her face, as if trying to decide what kind of questions she'd ask. I heard the car. Saw you go past the gallery window. Folk outside keeping their distance. They are. He made a small sound, not quite a laugh. As they should. Shaw reached his level. Even up close, he seemed a little far away, like a man who'd been listening to one sound for so long that all other sounds came to him through a layer of glass. There was a smell under the brine and damp, old oil, lamp-black, rope, and fainter, elusive, a metallic taint that tightened the tongue. "You found the body?" she asked. "Coast Guard called me," Grigg said. "I was finishing my rounds. Only saw him when the fog pulled back for a moment. He was already there. I didn't touch him." He swallowed. "I don't touch them." "Them?" He looked past her into the well of the stair, toward the door, toward the smear of gray fog at the threshold. "The ones that come back. Sometimes they come back." Shaw followed his gaze for a breath and then took the next step. "Walk me through your night." He climbed with her, slow and deliberate, as if each tread had its own memory he was stepping over. "I log the weather on the hour. 9, 10, 11. Midnight. Wind shifted at 1. Fog heavy. Sea sound was big." He tapped the curved inner wall with 2 fingers. "You feel it in here. It's like the towers listening." "And they bleeding?" She said the word with flat pragmatism, as if it were an entry in a manual. His jaw tightened, but when he answered it was with the steadiness of a man reciting a fact that costs him to believe. "It happens without human cause. Meaning no one makes it happen." He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. "Not with hands. Not with a knife. When the black tide turns, the tower sweats it from the seams. It isn't the first time and it won't be the last." They reached the next landing, a small platform with a hatch leading to a cupboard where old wicks and rags scented the air with oil that had penetrated the wood forever. Shaw took it in, cataloging without comment, and continued up. The sound of the sea changed slightly with each loop of the spiral, as if different frequencies found different purchase in the stone. The salt crystals were thicker here, textured in a faint lace along the rail, as if the tower had exhaled and left crystallized breath behind. "Who else was here?" she asked. "No one," Grigg said. "I don't have an assistant. Budget cuts. The relief man comes Thursdays." He rubbed at one eye with the heel of his hand, then seemed to think better of it and lowered his palm. "Thundered a bit out there just before 2. Couldn't see the beam more than 30 yards for the fog." "Did you notice anything inside?" Shaw let the question hang. "Any leaks? Any damage?" "No damage inside." He shook his head. "Not that the eye can find, anyway." His gaze climbed past her, up toward the lantern room, and his voice changed softer. "But there was a smell." Shaw knew it before he named it. It had been at the edge of her senses since the threshold, too faint to trust. "Iron." He said, "like old pennies on the tongue." The stairs narrowed toward the top, and the light changed from the anemic bulb glow to a paler wash filtering through the lantern room's windows. The upper chamber opened like the inside of a lantern itself. Glass all around, a crown of frames, the Fresnel lens nested at the center with its precise geometry and glass steps that gathered dawn like a ritual. Even in that clean, hard light, the smell was unmistakable. Faint, but there. Shaw's mouth watered in the involuntary way bodies respond to blood. Grigg hung back at the doorway, as if some rule, spoken or unspoken, kept him from crossing the threshold. "I do my checks before midnight and after 4, he said, standing just outside the circle cast by the lens. "Always have. There's no reason for me to be in here when the lamp's running." Shaw stepped into the lantern room, the world blurred on the far side of the glass panes. Fog and sea and pale sky smeared like chalk. The lens, with its ribs and prisms and concentric rings, was a cathedral of light engineering, every surface meant to bend illumination to service. She had seen them in photographs in museums, clean as glassware in a cabinet. This one was clean too, almost, but not everywhere. She circled slowly, the rubber of her soles quiet against the floorboards, and let her eyes find what her nose already had. A smear. It lay along one curve of the lens, no bigger than the line of a finger drawn once and taken away, the color dark and dulled as it dried, clinging to the flawless glass like a small insult. "You see it." Grigg's voice was tight. Shaw did not answer immediately. She leaned in, careful not to touch, and let the light catch the edges. The mark had the viscosity lines you get when something thicker than water has been dragged and then left to set. Along the very edge, in a place where only light would notice, a thinner arc had traveled farther, then halted. On the frame below, a single dot had dried to a flat brown. She took out her phone, snapped photographs from 3 angles, and then crouched to look along the line of the smear at a shallower rake, where flaws often betray themselves. The lens gave her back a shivered reflection. Her own eye, the grid of brass, the world beyond cut into panes. And there, caught in one notched seam between the prism steps, a grain of salt glinted. "Who has access to this room?" she asked, without looking back. "Just me," Grigg said. "And the relief Thursdays. Anyone else with a key? Harbor master? Coast Guard?" "No, they'd call me." She looked over her shoulder. "So, how does a smear get onto a surface you don't touch?" Grigg's mouth thinned. He looked at the beam's housing as if it were a living thing that could be shamed by being asked to account for itself. "You want me to say someone came in here in the night and put it there? I know the locks. I'd have heard the door. There's nowhere to hide. I make my rounds. The stair creaks when a foot hits the 4th tread. I've lived in this thing since I was 19. I know how it sounds. You're saying no one touched the lens. I'm saying the bleeding doesn't need a hand." His voice slid around the word bleeding like a skiff around a hidden rock. "It comes through. The seams sweat it. The tower gives it." He swallowed again. "I clean what I can when it's safe, but I never touch the lens at night. That's the rule. You don't lay a hand on the light when it's running." "Who made that rule?" He blinked. "My father. His father." Shaw moved to the opposite side of the lens, following the circumference with slow steps. The iron smell gathered at the edges of her nostrils and then drifted as the wind shifted outside, pushing damp through some unseen avenue. She looked for more. Another smear, a drip hardened along a frame, any sign of damage in the gasket lines. Nothing obvious. The glass was clean save for that one flaw. No visible injury inside. The place had the compulsive order of a keeper's domain. The cloths folded, the oil can hung by its wire, the maintenance log on the small stand bolted to the wall with a pencil tied to it by string. She flipped the log open with the back of her glove. Neat entries. Times, wind speed, visibility. The handwriting had the regularity of a man who checks the horizon more than he checks his feelings. She closed the book and saw Grigg watching her, waiting for her to tell him what kind of story he was living in. Outside, the fog thinned for a heartbeat and then clothed the lamp again. Wet light moving across glass like breath across a mirror. "Mr. Grigg," she said, "I'm going to have forensics up here. We'll swab the smear, the rail, the steps, the door fittings, and anything else I tell them. We'll do it now, before the air gets any ideas." His mouth worked. "You can do what you like, Inspector, but the next tide's in less than 12 hours. The black tide's due in 2 nights. If you've got something you want to take, you'd best take it before the sea decides otherwise." "What does the sea decide exactly?" He didn't answer. His eyes had gone to the lens again, to the place where the smear clung and caught the milky light. He stepped back 1 pace, as if to allow something invisible its space. Shaw looked a final time at the glass. A smear on a lens. It was a small thing in the scope of an investigation that had already reached outside ordinary edges. But small things become hinges if you set the weight of a case upon them just right. She walked past him into the stairwell. The salt rasped under her glove again as she palmed the rail. On the wall at shoulder level, she noticed, delicately, a spray of tiny dots she hadn't seen on the way up. Too fine for paint, too random for rust. A constellation that resolved into brown upon closer look. She photographed those too. "Have you cleaned since you called it in?" she asked. "No. You'll resist the urge. We'll take prints from the rail, shoe marks from the steps, swabs from the door. If anything shifts in the night, you call me. No one else." Grigg nodded. From below, the door boomed once, wind or a fisherman's curious nudge against the rope, and the sound rolled up the well, echoing in the hollow of the tower like a warning bell pressed into the stone. Shaw descended, counting the treads without meaning to, listening for the creak he'd mentioned. The fourth step complained softly, old wood telling old truths. On the second loop she paused and looked down the central void. The lighthouse was a corkscrew of space, a geometry designed to lift a flame above treachery. It should have felt like a sensible machine. Today it felt like a throat. Outside, the fog had lifted enough to make the sea visible as a long bruise of moving metal. The fishermen had retreated further along the shingle, forming a broken line of dark figures that pretended to busy themselves with nets they didn't touch. The rope cordon sagged where it was tied to the stake. The body under the sheet was a shape now, not a face. Shaw pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed. "Forensics," she said when the duty sergeant answered. "I need a team at Blackwater Point Lighthouse within the hour. Full kit. Swabs for biologicals, LCV, luminol, tape lifts for prints, and trace bags. We're sampling a smear on a Fresnel lens, interior rails and treads, door hardware, and any salt deposit concentrations. Masks and booties for all. I want comparisons ready before the next tide." She listened, eyes on the tower. Yes, before then. She ended the call and slid the phone away. Grigg had come to the threshold and stopped there. 1 foot in, 1 foot out, as if he couldn't decide whether he belonged more to stone or salt air. "When did you last sleep, Mr. Grigg?" she asked. He considered that as if it were a trick. "When the wind was kind," he said at last. Shaw looked up at the white shaft and the dark windows and thought of the smear. A small human line on a machine built to be perfect. Somewhere in the stack of details there would be a thing that did not agree with the others. There always was. Until then, she would collect what the place offered. Shaw orders forensic swabs before the next tide. Part 3, the folklore ledger. The pub sat back from the harbor road behind a wind-stunted elm, its sign creaking. The widow's lantern, a painted lamp throwing light over black water. At midday the place held the hush of rooms that remember last night too clearly. The smell of ale and old smoke in the beams, net floats hung along the bar, a brass ship's bell gone green with years. A coal fire ticked in the grate as if nursing its own private tide. Shaw stamped the wet from her boots on the mat and scanned the room. A few men nursed pints as if they were weather reports. Slowly, attentively, ready to change course if the foam told them something. Heads turned, then pretended they hadn't. Her badge might as well have been a flare in a fog bank. The landlord, a broad-shouldered woman with hair the color of slate, gave her a measuring look. "Inspector." The accent put soft stones in the words. "You'll be wanting warmth first." "Tea would do," Shaw said. She slid onto a bench near the fire and let the heat push the damp back out of her coat. On the shelf above the hearth lay a length of faded rope knotted into an ornate braid, and beside it a glass jar with something pale that had once been a candle but now held coins. For the light, someone had scrawled on the label in a hand that hadn't planned to be read. The landlord brought tea, set it down with a small clink, and followed Shaw's eyes to the shelf. "Fishermen leave for the lighthouse fund," she said. "Old habit. Makes them feel the lamp looks kindly their way. Does it? When it wants to." Shaw met her gaze. "I'm looking for a fisherman who keeps a ledger. Someone told me he writes things down that most folk only say." The landlord's mouth tightened, but not unkindly. She glanced toward a corner table where a man sat almost inside the shadows, a pint untouched in front of him, hands folded as if at chapel. His coat had been mended so often it was more repair than original fabric. A cap sat low over hair the color of driftwood. He watched the fire the way people look at the sea when they're remembering names. "Tomas Pendero," the landlord said softly. "Ask him nicely and he might show you what you came for. Ask him like London, and he'll leave you with your questions." Shaw rose with the tea in hand and crossed to the table. "Mr. Pendero?" He didn't start, just shifted his eyes to her face and waited. Up close, she could see the webs of cracked skin at his knuckles, a faint tattoo of an anchor gone soft and blue with age. His eyes were pale, the faded green of shallow water over sand. "I'm Eleanor Shaw," she said. "CID. May I sit?" He gestured at the opposite bench. "You may sit." Whether you'll like what you hear after is your own business. Shaw set the tea down, steam veiling her for a moment. I'm looking into this morning's death at the lighthouse. Aye. And into the bleeding. Aye. Silence held a chair for a few seconds. The fire cracked once, casting a quick new geography across the table. Shaw let the quiet do some work. Men like this don't answer to hurry. They answer to gravity. The landlord said you keep a ledger, she said at last. Stories. Dates. Pendero's gaze moved from her face to her hands, then to the steam rising from the cup, and back. It was an appraisal not of threat but of weight. I keep what my father kept, he said, and what his father before him kept. Not stories, counts, weighings and measures of a kind. He reached down into the shadow beside him and brought up a book wrapped in a square of sailcloth. He set it on the table as you might set down a newborn or a bomb, carefully, with the knowledge that either way you were accepting responsibility. He unknotted the cloth and folded it back. The book's leather had been seawater once. It had that particular stiff, then soft feel of things dried badly and used anyway. Watermarks ran across the cover like old estuaries. A clasp had been repaired with fishing line in a neat sailor's stitch. May I? Shaw asked. You may look, he said. You may even read, but you don't take it from this room. It's not meant to travel further than a lantern's throw. She slid the book toward her, and the smell came up. Iron gall ink, damp paper, a ghost of tar. The first page bore a careful hand. Bleeds and Black Tides of Blackwater Point, commenced 1889, with a flourish in the tail of the 9 as if the writer had been a little proud of the year. Beneath, a line in smaller script. Copied from my father's hearing and his father's before, for the sake of warning and witness. The name below that, Ezekiel Pendero. You see, Pendero murmured. It's not gossip, it's an account. Shaw turned the pages with care. The entries ran in columns. Date, weather, moon, sea, event. Margins held notes, addenda, small quarrels with earlier versions of the truth. The ink moved through shades as the decades moved under the hand. The crisp black of new iron gall, then brown, then pale where the nib had run low. She read, November 15th, 1889, moon new, sea dark and still as tar wind so west light. At 15 minutes past midnight, the light bled from the seam below the second ledge. Old Jonas Tregenza saw it from the mole, as did the lads of the trammel boat, and swore on St. Piran's head it ran true and warm. No storm followed, and 3 days later Ben Treherne washed up at Porthcaris with the gulls. Farther down the page, another hand had added, smaller. Ben had taken from the Sennin man 3 nets and a pig. Give and take both find their way back. Shaw felt her mouth dry and drank tea without tasting it. She flipped forward. The years unspooled. 1893, 1901, 1908. Bleeds on the black tide there, and bleeds again on the black tide, as if the phrase had become shorthand, a unit of weather like fog, heavy. The black tide was named as if it were a season, not an occurrence. In the margin of an 1893 entry, a note. Black tide is the night the sea drinks the sky and doesn't give it back until dawn. Someone had underlined drinks twice. What is the black tide to you? Shaw asked without looking up. Pendero sat very still. It's when the sea goes so dark you can't tell where she ends and the sky starts. No moon, no phosphor on the break. Nets come up with nothing that looks alive and everything that looks like it was never meant to be on a plate. The old ones say it's when the ocean remembers. I say it's when she does her sums. She turned to a thick page whose edges had been thumbed more than the rest. The year 1901 ran across the top, and the handwriting had changed, narrower, more precise. The entry dated March 13th read, bleeding at the first hour past midnight. Stain from the upper seam reached the rock in 4 minutes. Smell? Iron. Color? Red. Note also, figure seen on the tower, one form armed with a coil of rope. Climbed like a spider. No light in the lantern, the keeper said, on account of heavy fog and fouled wick. The figure threw down the rope and was gone by the time the harbor man reached the stairs. In the morning there was no mark of foot upon the salt on the treads. In the margin, a small drawing had been made in pencil, The tower in 3 strokes, a stick figure clinging to the curve, a rope looping down. The hand that drew it had known ropes. The coil lay with believable weight. A thumbprint, long dried to a gray oval, half smudged the sketch. Shaw sat back. Who drew this? My grandfather, I reckon, Pendero said. Or the man who was with him that night. He used to say, if you don't put a picture of a thing beside the words, it'll slip away and pretend it never happened. She turned more pages. 1916, a bleed during a blackout. 1927, a bleed and a missing deckhand from the Merrylegs. 1939, 1941, war years that treated unusual stains with bureaucratic silence in the margins. After the war, the hand changed again. The names of witnesses came and went. The words did not waver. Bleed, black tide, warm, no storm following. Several entries noted men who hadn't come home. Tom Berryman overboard off Penwith. Joe Morley found 3 days later at Pendine, eyes open. Stranger in a city coat taken by the water, no kin to claim him. Sometimes the ledger added a line about a debt, sometimes not. In 1954, bleed thick. A drifter went down off the head, but no lives lost. Paid beforehand, some say. Paid how? Shaw asked, turning back to him. Pendero's mouth made a line. That's the part gets loud in the telling and quiet in the writing. Best ask the men who think they know. Do you think you know? I think the sea keeps books. Better than we do. She went on. The ink got bluer in the 70s and 80s. The paper changed stock, whiter, smoother. But the words were the same words, as if the ledger itself insisted on a vocabulary you didn't mess with. In 1989, there was a longer entry, shaky with anger, bleed on the black tide. Harbor master called it vandalism. No one said different in a room where saying different cost berths. 2 nights after, the Tamsin Joy went down with the nets fouled on nothing we could find. We brought up water thick as stew and a crate lid we couldn't place. The sea took the lid back on the next set as if to say, mind your own. Shaw let the book rest under her hands, its weight undeniable, and saw what the outline of a story looks like when the story doesn't care if you believe it. These disappearances, she said, are they always tied to the bleeding? They don't always follow like a dog to a whistle, Pendero said. Sometimes they get there before you've called. Sometimes nothing happens at all, and that's what scares men most. Shaw flipped to the more recent years. The handwriting had thinned to a thread, the letters careful to the point of pain. 2003, bleed on the black tide. Stranger found at Paran Cove, pockets turned out. 2011, bleed slight. No storm. 2 weeks later, a man from away went off the rocks. No one saw him fall. 2019, bleed. Agnes Palglace says she dreamt the tower cried. Don't write that, she said. But I did. What made you start writing it down in the first place? Shaw asked. Your family, I mean. Pendero looked at the ledger like a man looks at a grave when he hasn't finished talking to it. Because talking is wind, and wind forgets where it was. Ink remembers. My great-grandfather said that when the keepers changed, the stories changed with them unless someone ashore kept the same words. Men drown. Men lie. Paper waits. She turned back to an early page and let the year 1901 look at her again. The sketch of the figure on the tower with the rope sat like a nail hammered exactly halfway in. Rope. A climb. No footprints in the salt on the stairs. Her mind slotted those words beside what she'd seen that morning. Salt crystals packed into the cracks on the stair, the smear along the lens, the rail freckled with dry dots finer than spray. Do all the entries happen on black tide nights? She asked, although the columns were already answering. Pendero nodded. Always. If blood shows on some other night, it doesn't make the book. But I've not seen that, and nor did my father. And the years with no entries? The years we like to die in our beds. Shaw let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. The fire's heat had penetrated her coat. Her face felt warmer than the rest of her. The room sounds, the scrape of a chair, the quiet thud of the landlord's step behind the bar, returned as if she'd been underwater and had just surfaced. May I photograph some pages? She asked. Pendero's jaw worked. 1 or 2. The rest you copy by hand if you mean to carry them. Things taken quick get lost quick. She drew her phone, asked first with her eyes, and when he gave a small nod she snapped images of the title page, the 1901 entry with the drawing, and the most recent black-tied note. The phone clicked like a small, obedient machine. She put it away. "You'll tell the men outside it's all just old men's writing," Pendero said, not quite a question. "I'll tell them what I can prove." She closed the ledger softly and tugged the sailcloth up around it. "And what I can't yet, I'll test." He tilted his head, eyes narrowing as if to bring some small distant thing into focus. "You're not here to win an argument with the sea, Inspector. You're here to know if the sea has her hands in men's pockets." Shaw stood. "I'm here because a man is dead." "Aye." He slid the wrapped ledger back into the shadow by his leg. "And maybe because a few others who aren't done yet want telling, too." She thanked him and stepped back into the pub's low light. The landlord glanced at her as she passed the bar. "Did he show you the page with the rope?" she asked in a voice that said she already knew the answer. "He did." "Good." She polished a glass that didn't require polishing. "We used to drink to that page. Now the men drink around it." Outside, the day had decided to keep its color to itself. Shaw crossed the road to where the harbor wall held back a high gray sea and drew her coat in tighter. The gulls were lower now, hunting the wind for something to push against. Down the quay, a boy kicked at a coil of rope and his mother hauled him away, scolding in a voice that knew the exact shape of disaster and wouldn't use it. Shaw pulled out her notebook and wrote 3 columns. Dates/witnesses/notes. She added black tide beside each entry she'd photographed, then a 4th column, missing/found. The rhythm of the ledger, the steady chant of bleed nights, ran like a pulse under her list. She underlined 1901, rope, no prints in salt, and circled the phrase until the paper thinned. The phone felt heavy in her pocket. She drew it, thumbed to the photographs, and let the sketch look back at her. A small man on a big tower, rope uncoiling into blank space. On the lens this morning, a smear of blood. On the stair, salt like frost. On the wall outside, a red that ran with a will of its own. The past doesn't explain the present. It only insists on a family resemblance. She slid the phone away, turned her collar up against a wind that had decided to go to work, and started back toward the station car. There were archives that would answer what a ledger demanded. Police reports, missing persons, drownings filed as accidents because there were only so many boxes on the form. She could trawl those waters faster than any man with a net. Shaw compares dates with police archives. Part 4, Archives of the Lost. The records room in Truro had the smell of sunless paper and old toner. Flat, utilitarian, incapable of superstition. Shaw liked that about it. She spread her notebook on a metal desk beneath a buzzing strip light and opened 2 worlds side by side. Pendero's photographed ledger pages on her phone, and the police archive terminal blinking an anodyne welcome. Ink and database. Tide and statute. She started with dates. The ledger named 14 nights when the lighthouse bled on a black tide. She keyed each into the incident index, fingers finding a rhythm. Year, month, day enter. Each query dredged up reports from the coast. Male found on foreshore. Apparent fall, unidentified man swept from rocks. No witnesses, body recovered by lifeboat, presumed suicide. She built a column, then another, case number, location, time, weather, ruling. By the 7th match, the pattern had a pulse. By the 10th, it had a face. 14 black tides. 14 reports within 24 hours either side. Not always at the lighthouse foot, but near enough that the beam would have touched their last horizon. Porthcaris, Gadrivi, Pendine, nameless coves that ate boots and gave back empty hats. She underlined each match and drew a bracket along the page until the margin was a ladder of black. The registry cards were worse. The victims, when they had names, were men who had not attached themselves to Cornwall. Deckhands from visiting trawlers. A carpenter on a short contract. A man with a backpack who had paid cash for a bunk at a hostel and told the owner he was between things. Transient workers with day rate lives, here and unhere. Two had union cards from ports 3 counties away. One had a ferry ticket stub and pockets turned out. Another had a wallet with no ID at all, only a folded photograph of a child and woman looking straight into summer. Mostly male. Mostly strangers to the headlands they died beside. The locals would say the sea didn't know their names. The files said the same thing in kinder type. The rulings lined up like neat apologies. Accidental death, misadventure, suicide, insufficient evidence to the contrary. Shaw scrolled each PDF until she met the paragraph that made the decision. In time, the paragraphs took on the same voice, as if one clerk had written them all across decades. No signs of third-party involvement. Terrain hazardous. Visibility poor. Deceased was alone. The language had a bureaucracy's gentleness, the sort that lays a blanket over a body it doesn't have time to know. Only one report, a 1989 drowning, hinted at argument. The investigating officer had added a line that felt like a flinch. Unusual staining reported at lighthouse. No photographic record present. Presumed vandalism. The word unusual did more work than it had been paid for. Shaw rose and crossed to the microfilm bank against the wall, where older years waited in translucent spools behind plastic doors that clicked when handled. She pulled the drawer for missing persons, regional, and fed a reel-dated 1978 to 1995 into the reader. The machine woke with a soft whir. Headlines and notices dragged across the screen in leaps. FTE. WI meeting. Man wanted for questioning. Harbor race. Under those, the small sad classifieds of the sea. Missing since last seen, wearing. The names had a way of leaning left on the page, as if they were walking toward the door as the ink dried. She noted down the ones that fell on black tide nights. The coincidence had stopped being a coincidence 5 entries ago, but discipline required she treat each with the same cool hands. 14 out of 14. If the ledger was superstition, then superstition had been walking beside official memory for a century, whispering the same dates. Her phone buzzed once. A forensics tech confirming receipt of samples from the lighthouse and promising priority processing. She texted back a single word, please, then returned to the terminal and opened a query under Roker. James. The name belonged to the man on the rocks that morning, even if she hadn't allowed herself to say it at the scene. The Coast Guard had found the wallet zipped in an inner pocket, salt slick, ID intact beneath a film of seawater that hadn't eaten the laminate yet. The system returned 3 hits. The first, a London address in the records of a private firm, North Atlantic Indemnities, Limited, with the title Maritime Claims Investigator. The second, a series of ferry bookings and car hires across the last 6 months that mapped a wandering line along the south coast, Plymouth, Falmouth, Newlyn, like a man tracing rumors with petrol and patience. The third, a regional alert lodged 2 weeks prior requesting any police contact be logged discreetly. Inquirer sensitive. Insurance, then. He had come to Cornwall in a profession that asks the sea to explain itself and then itemizes the answer. She scanned the firm's online register through the terminal's limited browser and found him listed with a phone number that rolled straight to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. She cross-checked Roker against accommodation databases. The local tourism board maintained a spreadsheet, the sort with too many columns and a color-coding scheme only its maker understood. Goose houses, B&BS holiday lets. Shaw filtered for recent single-occupancy bookings paid in cash. One address near Blackwater Point bubbled to the top. A small B&B with 3 rooms and a name painted in cheerful script on a slate. The Smuggler's Rest. The registry note. Guest, John Rowe. The last letter curled badly, as if the pen had slipped. The number he'd given had an extra digit. False name. Sloppy or deliberate. Either way, it was a mask. She printed the register copy and stapled it to her notes. On a hunch, she compared the date of his check-in with the tides chart pinned above the duty desk. Someone at the station was still the sort who kept moon and water on paper, inked in blue and red. Roker had checked in 3 days before the black tide was due. He had circled his nights the way the dead man in the ledger had circled danger a century ago. Not a tourist, then. A man waiting for a particular darkness. Shaw rubbed her eyes and felt salt grit on her lashes that hadn't come from the room. She returned to the terminal and opened deceased. Roker, ASIC, entries. The screen threw back a list of older claims he'd worked. Fraudulent sinkings, arson for claim schemes, a ferry incident in which a captain had sworn the hull wept pitch before the engine died. Roker moved through lies the way a diver moves through water, efficiently holding his breath. Men like that sometimes forgot the sea didn't have to let them surface. She dialed the insurance firm. An operator with a voice like fine chain mail answered, took her name and extension, and promised a callback from his supervisor. Shaw hung up and pulled the microfilm reel forward to 2003. A thin note in a constable's tight script caught her eye. Unidentified mail recovered at Paran Cove. No local ties. Lodging record suggests alias used. Case closed, no suspicious circumstances. Across the bottom of the frame, someone had written in pencil years later, a single impatient word. Rubbish. Shaw smiled without humor. The terminal's clock ticked another minute off. She gathered her notes into a shape that pleased the part of her brain that loved sequences. 14 black-tied alignments. Victims predominantly male from elsewhere, engaged in work that left few threads for a county coroner to follow. Rulings that folded the living away neatly and left the dead untroubled by courtrooms. And now, James Roker, professional knot-picker, come to pull at a curse and getting his hands caught in the line. She printed the summary sheet and clipped it to a manila folder, then slid Pendrose dates inside as if she were nesting one century inside another. The folder was already acquiring weight, the kind that changes the way a thing swings in your hand. At the doorway, she paused, looking back at the quiet rows of files. The room was all fluorescent honesty. It had never seen a tide come in, never watched a lighthouse sweat red. But the facts here and the whispers in the pub met like two currents out past the headland. You couldn't see the join, only the chop where the surface broke strange. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She answered. Miss Shaw? North Atlantic Indemnities, said a man's voice. Clipped, southern. You called about Mr. Roker. I did. We'd prefer to speak in person. I'm in Truro. Pause. We'll send someone. Do that. She ended the call before the operator could wrap it in courtesies, then pulled her coat collar up and headed for the stairs. The afternoon had already turned cold in her imagination. She wanted the sea wind on her face before she went to knock on a door and ask a woman why a man had signed her guest book with a name that didn't belong to him. She visits the B&B owner. Part 5, the room with the sea view. The smuggler's rest sat on the cliff road with a view that made postcards jealous. The slate hanging by the door had been lettered in hopeful white paint and pitted clean again by salt. Shaw pressed the bell and heard it rattle somewhere in the bones of the house. A woman in her 50s answered with the briskness of someone who had learned to be polite to strangers and suspicious of them at the same time. Lorna Tresitter, she said. You'll be the inspector. Eleanor Shaw, she confirmed, showing the card. I'm here about your guest, John Rowe. She let the unfinished letter hang between them. Lorna exhaled through her nose, a tide going out over shingle. I paid cash, took the upstairs room. Said he wanted quiet and the sea. I've not touched it since the call came. I thought you'd want it as it was. Thank you. On the way up, the stair carpet changed from floral to threadbare, the kind of gentle decline that happens when you clean what you can afford. At the landing, Lorna paused with the key in the lock. He was tidy, she said, as if the fact had been a kind of courtesy she wished to repay on his behalf. Didn't talk much. Went out early, came in late. He watched the lighthouse after dark. Stood right at the window sometimes. I told him fog gathers in there and gets in your bones. He said he liked it. She turned the key and swung the door open. The room faced the long, bleak sweep of water and cliff. The window, an old sash, stood open an inch, enough for the air to carry in its continual testimony. The smell hit first. Brine, clean and simple, as if the room had been rinsed in the sea and left to dry without towels. It had a way of settling on your tongue. Under it lay the thin musk of a place that had been lived in respectfully and left in a hurry. Shaw stepped to the threshold and let her eyes map the space. Bed made, quilt smoothed, a mug with a brown ring, a jacket folded on the chair back, pockets turned outward as if someone had checked them twice. On the sill, grains of salt had formed a faint ridge where damp had kissed wood. She kept her hands off surfaces and moved straight to the small desk under the window. There, sheets of paper weighted by a shell. Tide charts, the sort you buy in a chandlery for £1 and then crease into eighths to keep in a pocket. Blue lines, little printed moons, red and black numbers lifting and falling like a child's drawing of breath. On 3 dates across the last fortnight, someone had drawn circles in red ink so firm the pen had cut slightly into the paper. The nights of the black tide, exactly as Pendero's ledger had counted them for generations. The circles were not perfect. They had the human wobble of a hand thinking of something else while it marked a fact. She photographed the charts, framing the red rings with the window's dull light. The room had a hushed quality she associated with hospital wards at dawn. A suspension in which everything in view knows what came next and is waiting for you to catch up. "Did he bring anyone up here?" Shaw asked without turning. "No," Lorna said, "and I'd have known if he had. House is old, stairs tell me when a foot is on them." "You keep a register?" "In the kitchen. You can look." He wrote John Rowe and left a number with too many noughts in. "I let it pass." She winced at herself. "Cash makes you polite." Shaw nodded absently and slid open the desk drawer with a knuckle under the wood to avoid smudging prints. Inside lay a cheap spiral-bound notebook, a few pens, an elastic band tired enough to have forgotten its vocation. The notebook had a page torn out near the middle, the uneven white of fibers pulled the wrong way. The torn edge still held a small triangle, as if whoever had ripped it had been careful until the last second and then not careful at all. She lifted the cover back and saw the indentations that missing pages leave behind, the ghost of handwriting pressed into the next sheet. Pressure marks. She slipped a sheet of plain paper behind, took the pencil from beside the notebook, and began to shade gently across the surface at a shallow angle, the way she had been taught when she still had time for courses and instructors. Soft graphite built in the valleys of the indent, climbing toward legibility. Lines of block capitals rose from the fibers. A list, written in a deliberate hand by a writer who had not expected anyone else to see it but who had expected himself to be exact. Calder and Coastal Marine. Tern Atlantic Freight. Orion Weight Carriers. Pennine Global Shipping. Sable Finch Shipping. She paused. The words looked wrong in their order until they were right. Not destinations, not vessels, companies. Firms big enough to have lawyers and small enough to have corners. The last line's shape tugged at her with that little itch of recognition that polices live for. Sable Finch. She had seen it somewhere. Not in her own case files. Not in the list of current claims. In the archives? In a harbor office notice? A newspaper clipping about a storm season wreck with a bird name in it? The name tasted of tar and law. She shaded the next few lines. Below the company names, 2 words had been underlined hard enough to almost cut the paper. Hull Claims and Salvage Rights. Then, on a fresh line, a question mark, and beneath it, Valiant Compass? The punctuation was truculent. Roker had been arguing with himself and losing. She finished the rub, photographed the page, then slid the notebook into an evidence bag and labeled it. The pencil went into another. She looked at the desk again, bent to the chart edge, and saw the indentation of another circle, the lightest of marks where the pen had hovered before committing to the red. Roker had rehearsed his ring before he drew it. On the windowsill, the salt ridge had lengthened by a few grains as the draft moved through. She looked up at the hinge and saw a scraped patch. Someone had opened the window at night and leaned on his elbows to watch the lighthouse do whatever it does. The paint had taken a tired thumbprint and kept it. Lorna stood where she had when they came in, arms folded, eyes on the bed as if to make sure it stayed made. "He asked me about shipwrecks," she said into the hush. Not in a tourist way. He had names. He said, "Do you remember?" And I had to say, "My father might." I was busy raising children when boats went down. I could tell he wanted to ask someone older, but he didn't have a way to be invited. "What names?" Shaw asked. She shook her head. "I don't hold them, but one had a pretty sound, like a thing you'd paint on a hull and then wish you hadn't." She wrinkled her nose. "Bird. Something bird." Shaw waited, The window let a colder thread of air in, and the curtains stirred like a slow breath. "Finch," Lorna said suddenly, pleased to have netted the fragment. "That was it. Finch." He said it like it mattered. Shaw nodded once. "Sable Finch. You know it." "I will." She took another photograph, desk, charts, window, the world over which men build lighthouses, and then asked them to keep the rules. Did he leave anything else? Receipts? A map? Lorna opened the wardrobe and lifted out a shoebox. Inside were the polite remains of a traveler. 2 till receipts for petrol, a folded slip with a registration number, a cheap torch with sand in its switch, and a business card for North Atlantic Indemnities with a handwritten extension that matched the one that had called her back from the archives. The card had a greasy thumb smear across the logo. Somebody had told Roker to be careful, and he had been careful until he ran out of time. Shaw bagged the receipts and the torch, then drew a square of tape across the sash to keep the window at the same mean inch. "I'll need you to leave the room as is for now," she said. "We'll dust and lift and swab." "As long as you like," Lorna said. It wasn't holy generosity. The room felt in between, and the house wanted its equilibrium back. At the kitchen table, Shaw leafed the register. John Rowe had been written on the line with a finicky neatness that didn't match Roker's block capitals in the notebook. The last letter had stuttered. It made the name look like a lie said with good posture. She took a quick phone photo and returned the book to its place under the tea caddy as Lorna had left it. Some rituals didn't need interfering with. Back upstairs, she took one last long look at the desk. The charts were the key a child might draw for a map in a book. A red ring meaning here be something that eats ships. The lists in the notebook were the other half. The names of people with offices far from the sound of waves who profited when metal sank and men didn't float. And the last line, Sable Finch Shipping, now rang like a bell under the wall of the lighthouse she had stood beneath that morning. "Do you know the harbor master?" she asked Lorna at the door. "Harry," Lorna said. "Everyone knows Harry." She hesitated. "He won't thank you for asking about the Finch. It was a bad season. Men measure years by the way their boats came home. That year didn't come home right." Shaw nodded. "All the same." On the landing, she paused. The smell of brine crept out with her, down the stairs, into the hall like a companion who didn't know it was no longer welcome. It didn't fade when the door to the room closed. Some scents leave with the air. Some hang back to be counted. Outside, the light had flattened into that pewter that means weather is making up its mind. The lighthouse was a white bone in the mist. Shaw zipped her coat. The names in her notebook felt like stones in a pocket. Calder and Coastal Marine, Tern Atlantic Freight, Orion Wade Carriers, Pennine Global Shipping, Sable Finch Shipping. Roker had torn the page where they were written and taken it with him. The ghost of the writing had stayed. Ghosts are good at that. She started the car and checked the time. The harbor office would still be open, and Harry would still be there, getting ready to go home and not going yet. Roker had been circling corporate names on paper. Shaw would circle the names carved into plaques mounted in harbor rooms where men pretend history behaves. She seeks shipwreck records. Part 6, The Wreck of the Sable Finch. The harbor office was a low room with salt in its timber and a tide table nailed up where a crucifix would have been in another life. Charts curled at the corners, damp forever trying to lift paper away from pins. A kettle clicked tiredly behind the counter. Shaw knocked, then let herself in at Harry's shout. Harry Tregear was the sort of man harbors grow for. Broad through the shoulders, beard gone winter gray, eyes the pale of mornings that haven't made up their minds. He clocked her badge, then her boots, then the notebook, and came to a decision without ceremony. "Tea," he offered, already pouring. "You look like you've been listening to the sea with your face." "Inspector Shaw," she said. "I'm following a line that snags on a name. The Sable Finch." Harry's hand paused with the mug midair. "Haven't heard that said out loud in a while." He set the tea down, then rested both palms on the counter as if steadying a chart in a gust. "That was a black tide night." "You're certain?" "I could find the tide in my bones if you took the tables away." He lifted his chin toward the nailed-up chart. "Moon gone. Sea blacker than sense. No light on the water." Night like that eats the beam and spits it back weak. The Finch called a mayday at 047, engine trouble, then what sounded like a hull kiss somewhere it shouldn't. Then nothing. We launched. Fog took us by the nose and made a fool of it. He looked past her, toward the window where the harbor lay in its gray dish. We found her by sound more than sight. Men shouting, then one voice, then no voices. You don't forget the order of that. Survivors. 2, he said, pulled from the water near the head, both too cold to be clever. One made it as far as the station heater and spilled bits and pieces. The other was green with diesel and kept asking if we'd seen any crates. Kept saying, "Don't let them take the crates." He rubbed the bridge of his nose with a forefinger as if the words were still there in salt. He died before dawn. Shaw opened her notebook. Cargo. Harry barked a laugh that didn't enjoy itself. Manifests are for men who mean them. Officially, she carried assorted nautical instruments for an exhibition up the coast. Unofficially, he made a small circling gesture with his hand, gathering rumors from the room. There was talk before she sailed. Quiet talk. Paintings tucked into tea chests. Statuary stripped of names. Shipments bought with clean checks and dirty intent. A private collector with a long shadow and short patience. He shrugged. Smuggling of rare art through the cargo holds. If you want the phrase that gets men's backs up. Customs. They asked the right questions the day after and stopped asking by the end of the week. That sort of silence arrives with a letterhead. Shaw leaned on the counter. And salvage. Harry's mouth went crooked. Now there's the part that sits wrong in the teeth. No official salvage was ever recorded for the Finch. Not a license issued, not a fee paid. If anyone took so much as a brass drawer pull off her, they didn't do it where a clerk could see. He stepped away, opened a drawer, and brought out a ledger of his own thick, current, the harbor's living memory in binding. He flipped to the year 20 years gone and ran a finger down ruled columns. See? Nothing. She goes down. We log the coordinates as best we can. Then fog, then storms, then nothing. As far as the Crown is concerned, she's a ghost with no pockets. And as far as you're concerned? He looked up, unblinking. I saw lights offshore that week. Small ones. Working lights. Didn't look like men fishing. Looked like men working at something that wanted not to be seen. Shaw glanced toward the microfilm reader in the corner. Do you have the incident file? Harry's glance followed hers and stuck. We did. Council sent a boy last year to modernize the archives. Put things neat on spools so the damp wouldn't eat them. He made a right project of it. When he was done, we had indexes with tabs and I had a headache. Can I see it? Harry shrugged assent, then watched her with a squint that said he was bracing for disappointment while hoping to be wrong. Shaw fed the reel for 2005 into the reader. Wound to the week the Sable Finch went down and began to scroll. The machine threw enlargements of clipped reports onto the screen. Weather warnings, lifeboat launch, local boat in difficulty. She found the incident frame, Sable Finch, distress call received, and traced her finger along the column until she reached witness statements. The next frame should have been the transcriptions. Instead, white leader tape, then a jump cut to an unrelated meeting's minutes. She scrolled back, forward, then back again with the impatience of a person who knows an answer has been removed. White where black should be, blank where handwriting should tell the stubborn truth. Harry came to stand with his mug near her shoulder. You see it. Missing, Shaw said. Survivors' statements. Spliced out. Vanished from the microfilm, he said. The words dulled by having said them before and gotten nowhere. When I asked the boy who'd done the transfer, he said the original pages were illegible due to moisture damage and therefore omitted for integrity of the record. I asked him what kind of integrity is a record that doesn't remember what it's for. He took a drink. He said he'd written the phrase in his report. Do you still have the paper originals? He shook his head. We boxed what was readable and sent it to county. What wasn't, we were told to dispose of to stop the fungus sharing itself about. So the only copy is that, Harry finished. looking at the white strip where men's words should have been. And that has a gap where something sharp should be. Shaw watched the blankness a moment longer, as if the missing text might reassert itself under stare alone. Then she wound on and found the incident summary. Vessel presumed lost due to engine failure and collision with submerged hazard in poor visibility. 2 recovered. 1 deceased in transit. No suspicion of foul play. Salvage N/A. She tapped the abbreviation gently with her knuckle. Not applicable. Harry's jaw worked. Funny word for a wreck with hands in her pockets. He moved away then, back to the counter, back to the kettle. Shaw let the reel spin back to its rest and crossed to the wall where a photograph hung in a narrow frame. The lighthouse in clear weather, gulls frozen like punctuation around it. A keeper standing on the gallery in a dark sweater, hand up to shield his face from the sun. The brass plaque beneath bore the date and, in small official letters, the name of the man in the picture. Keeper R. Grigg. She looked over her shoulder. This was the keeper when the Finch went down? Harry followed her gaze inside. Robert Grigg, Tom's father. He rubbed his thumb across the rim of his mug, polishing a circle that didn't need it. He resigned the week after we called off the search. Walked out with a rucksack and his boots tied together by the laces the way lads do. Didn't collect his last wages. Didn't leave a forwarding address. Where did he go? Depends who you ask. Some say upcountry. Some say Ireland. Some say he took a small boat out on a morning when the sea didn't mind. I say a man doesn't leave a tower like that unless something has leaned on him hard. Shaw stepped closer to the photograph. Grigg in the sun, eyes lost to glare. A man knitted into the geometry of a place. The surname was a rope that had been thrown up this tower more than once. Penrose's ledger said so without needing to. The old entries had mentioned keepers without names, but the rhythm had a family shape if you knew how to hear it. Why did he resign? She asked, knowing the answer and not expecting the truth. Harry made a helpless gesture. Said he wanted different air in his lungs. That's what his letter said. But the men at the bar say he'd been at the cave under the foundation. That he knew what was in there and decided not to know. I don't drink to that kind of talk. It gives the sea ideas. Shaw looked back at the microfilm reader. Blank where statements should be. No salvage license. A rumor of rare art hauled across water like contraband saints. A keeper who left without turning to watch the light he'd kept. The case was a rope with knots tied at intervals you could count with your hands. Who else would remember the Finch? She asked. Harry thought. Old Agnes would tell you what her father told her. The widow who runs the pub remembers the men who didn't come home. The Coast Guard log has what the Coast Guard log has and no more. But if you want names that don't appear on lists, you talk to families. Grigg's mother is dead. His father... He stopped, corrected himself. Tom's father, he was the last Grigg above that threshold. Unless Tom has a son he hasn't told us about, and he doesn't. Shaw wrote R. Grigg, resignation 1 week post-rec, whereabouts unknown in her book. The ink looked neat and unconcerned. It was lying on her behalf. She closed the notebook and slid it into her coat. Outside, the harbor clattered with chain on wood as someone shifted a length of anchor line. The light beyond the window bent toward late. Fog offshore thickened as if following a timetable older than trains. You ever see the tower bleed? She asked, not turning. Harry was slow to answer. I've seen the wall red, yes. On nights when the water makes a liar of men. I don't spend language on it in daylight. She nodded because she understood what he was refusing. Thank you for the file. For the blank. He smiled without parting his lips. It's the sort we have too many of. Shaw left him to his kettles and charts. On the quay, the gulls hung in a crosswind and scolded everything. Far out, the white tooth of the lighthouse showed between veils of weather. A surname anchored there, running down from a photograph and further, if the ledger was right, to a line of men who knew how stair treads creak and what rules you don't write in logs. The sable Finch had come down on a black tide night. Rumor said she carried things that shouldn't have to float. Official salvage didn't exist, at least not where anyone could be paid for it. Survivor words had been cut from the town's memory and tucked somewhere less public than a spool. And a Grig had stepped away from stone he'd been born to, leaving a hole a sun had filled. Shaw suspects link between wreck and lighthouse keeper lineage. Part 7, Keeper's Bloodline. The parish office kept its history in gray metal drawers that looked as if they'd outlived 3 rectors in every fashion. The clerk, a woman with the steadiness of a metronome, rolled out a drawer marked births, marriages, deaths, Blackwater and environs, and set a tissue-thin folder on the table with the care you give to a living thing that happens to be paper. Shaw traced the column headings: name, occupation, residence, notations, then began at the bottom and read her way up through the century like climbing a tide gauge. Grig, Thomas, B. 1979. Occupation, lighthouse keeper, appointed 2003. Grig, Robert, B. 1953. Occupation, lighthouse keeper, appointed 1976. Resigned 2005. Grig, Elias, B. 1872. Occupation, lighthouse keeper, appointed 1898. Deceased 1934. In the notations column beside Elias, a clerk's hand from another age had added a line in iron gall ink that time had browned. 1901. Incident at light. See board minutes. Someone had returned later, perhaps in the 40s, and underlined incident and added, smaller, first recorded bleed, keeper's testimony. Shaw let out a breath. Pendrow's ledger went back to 1889. The Lighthouse Board's official memory began in 1901. Superstition had a head start on bureaucracy. Both were telling the same story in the languages they trusted. "May I copy this?" she asked. The clerk slid over a form and a blunt pencil. "Briefly," she said, as if brevity were a moral duty. "We also hold the board's minutes on microfiche." On the reader, 1901 clicked into place with the light jitter of old text becoming present. Minutes of the Lighthouse Board, Southwest Sector, March 13, 1901. An item mid-page. On unusual discoloration of tower masonry coincident with nocturnal conditions. Beneath, the euphemisms arranged themselves in neat Victorian rows. Keeper E. Grig reports substance of sanguine appearance, issuing at seams of lantern platform during hours of darkness. No breach of apparatus. No injury to personnel. Phenomenon unaccounted for by extant mechanical explanation. The final line sounded like a man turning a face away from a conversation he had no words for. Matter to be observed and recorded. No external communication advised. Shaw photographed the frame. The clerk pretended not to see. Across the fiche, years rolled. 1916, bleed noted during blackout. 1927, keeper reports, staining. The board learned to be duller as the world got louder. By late afternoon, Shaw had a family ladder. Elias Grig, the 1901 keeper. Robert, the man in the harbor office photograph resigning after the Sable Finch. Thomas, the gaunt-eyed son keeping salt and hours today. Every rung set during or just after black tide entries in one ledger or another. Each generation kept the light while the sea kept its books. She stepped out into a slice of weak sun and let it find her face. The road to the point was a narrow thread of tarmac washed with grit and the smell of kelp drying on rock. At the lay-by below the lighthouse, a van from the council sat with its hazard lights blinking a patient metronome. The fishermen who had gathered at dawn were gone. Men have work even when there are stories to attend to. Grig stood by the door of the keeper's cottage, a low, salt-stained building tucked into the tower's lee as if the lighthouse sheltered its own shadow. He watched her approach without moving, the posture of a man who knew visitors sometimes left with pieces of his life. "I went to the parish," Shaw said. "Your grandfather, Elias. He was the keeper here at the time of the board's first recorded bleed." Grig's mouth tightened at the edges. "A lot of firsts depend on who's writing them down." "True." She stopped an arm's length away. The wind riffled the corner of a curtain behind the cottage window and brought the damp smell of stone into the daylight. "But the names are the same. Elias, Robert, Thomas. This place keeps your family like a habit." He looked past her toward the rail where the cliff begins. "Someone has to work it." It's not a church you can close when the congregation gets thin. And the black tide? It seems to arrive on your watch generation after generation. That's because the tide comes whether my name's on the key or not. She let the moment breathe, then said, as if they were simply exchanging times for a delivery, "There are rumors of a family debt to the sea." Grig's eyes flicked to hers and away, a quick flare that could have been anger or a muscle remembering pain. Rumors are a way for people to put a shape to what they can't stand to look at. Spell the shape for me. He shook his head. I keep the lamp. I tend the lens. I write my logs. I climb when the weather says climb, and I fix what the salt eats. Anything beyond that is pub talk. Pub talk that mentions payments and calm seas after. He laughed once, a sound with no mirth in it. You've been to the widow's lantern. They'll tell you the sea accepts coin if it's pressed hard enough. Those men would bargain with God if they thought he knew the marks on their nets. Don't bring me their debts. Shaw didn't step toward him. She simply changed where she was standing so that the cottage door sat between them like a question. Your logs, then, she said. Let me see the last month. He held her eyes long enough to make a decision visible, then turned, opened the door, and stood aside. Don't touch anything the way you're not supposed to, he said, and the words were as much to himself as to her. The cottage smelled of paraffin and bread. A kettle clicked somewhere, forgotten after the boil. The rooms were narrow but ordered, the kind of order that believes in lists. On a small table beneath a framed photograph of the lighthouse in a former century, a stack of maintenance books sat in chronological obedience, the topmost bound in blue buckram stamped lighthouse, log, maint. Shaw pulled on nitrile gloves from her pocket and opened it. Columns, time, wind, visibility, barometer, notes. The entries were in the same neat, regular hand she'd seen upstairs on the stand in the lantern room. Midnight rounds, lamp check, foghorn 320 tested, sound fair, salt ingress in lower stair, brushed, replace gasket seal on north pane. Then a gap that wasn't a gap. 2 pages were missing, not from the end but from between a week and the next. They had been removed cleanly enough to masquerade as an accident, but not so cleanly that the fibers at the spine didn't tell on the hand that had done it. Shaw eased the book nearer the window where the light was better and looked at the rhythm of dates. The missing leaves covered 4 days in the last fortnight, beginning the night after Roker checked into Lorna's B&B, ending the morning a gale line had scratched the harbor. Where are these pages? She asked without looking up. What pages? Grigg said too quickly. The ones you felt needed to be in your pocket. His face went slack, then hard. If a page tears, it tears. That book's older than you. Shaw turned the ledger sideways, searching for the thin shadow where a blade had gone in. Not a tear, a cut. The edge gleamed microscopic white where it had been sliced. Paper doesn't tear clean like this, she said. And you don't cut paper by accident. He placed both hands flat on the table, the stance of a man steadying a thing that wants to move. You think I'd falsify my own logs? I think you live in a tower that bleeds on a timetable you don't set. She kept her voice level. And I think a man from London came here to ask about a ship called the Sable Finch, and now he's dead. So yes, I think you might remove 2 pages if you thought it'd save you telling a story before you'd made up your mind how to tell it. He looked at the wall behind her, then out the window, then at the photograph of the older lighthouse with its earlier gallery and a keeper in a wool coat and cap, Elias perhaps, or one of the nameless men with their backs to the wind. When he spoke, the words were careful. The logs are maintenance. They're not a diary. They don't carry burdens they're not meant to. What did you write on those pages? Wind, fog, oil, and what else? He pressed his lips together until the color went out of them. I don't keep secrets for their own sake. Shaw closed the book softly. Sometimes a secret keeps you, she said. That's different. She looked around the room without moving her feet. Hooks with a spare oilskin. A row of labeled drawers. Gaskets, wicks, fasteners. A small brass compass on the shelf. Not the compass, a practical mariner's tool polished by thumb. Nothing more. A glass jar on the sill with a twist of rope inside, spliced into a perfect eye. Order so practiced it squeaked if you tried to turn it. Where did your father go when he resigned? She asked, as if the question had been part of the same sentence as wind, fog, oil. Griggs' gaze hardened. If I knew, I'd have gone to see him. Did he talk to you about 1901? About Elias? My father didn't talk about the black tide. He talked about corrosion and lamp upgrades and idiots in kayaks. But he left a tower most men would be buried under. The muscle in Griggs' jaw ticked. Not all inheritances are fortunes. She let the silence widen until it had a shape, then nodded toward the blue logbook. I'm going to take this. She lifted a hand when he started to protest. On loan. Signed, sealed. I'll return it. In the meantime, she looked him in the eye as if making a promise neither of them wanted. I'm ordering a forensic search of your quarters. Swabs for trace, lifts for prints, sweep for cut fibers in the bin, and a reconstruction of whatever those 2 pages were before they weren't. He didn't move. She could see the breath go in, go out, each one counted, as if he were walking a narrow path and didn't trust the ground. You think I killed your man, he said at last. I think you're standing between me and the thing that did, she said, whether you mean to or not. He looked down at his hands as if hoping they might tell him what side they were on. Outside, the wind shifted and the tower made a sound like a long exhale. Shaw stepped back from the table, drew her phone, and made the call she needed to make. The cottage's air felt suddenly full, not with movement, but with attention, as if the place itself had started listening. Shaw orders forensic search of keeper's quarters. Part 8 Salt and Iron. They came just after noon, a small storm of zipped cases and method, breathing through masks that fogged on the first inhale. The lighthouse swallowed them one by one until all that remained outside was weather. Inside, the spiral took their rubber saws and made them speak, squeak, pause, climb. As they worked upward with swabs and powder, downward with tape lifts and numbered flags. Shaw kept to the base at first, near the threshold where the wall's red had crusted into a dull embroidery at stone level, a geography of runs and dots now turned brown. She signed for the lantern room smear swabs, then for the rail prints, then for the door hardware. The main staircase, under strong light, showed more than the eye liked. A drift of fine crystals along the inner edge, the faint scuffs of work boots where Grigg made his loops, an irregular freckling of brown too fine for spray. The fourth tread still complained, old wood reciting its one-line story. Inspector? One of the techs called softly from halfway up. You'll want to see this. She climbed to where he knelt, gloved finger pressing the rail to pivot his weight as he leaned over the void. He wasn't looking up the stair but down, into the wedge of darkness between the inner curve of the steps and the central core. The beam of his torch cut a pale slice and stopped dead on wood that shouldn't have been there. What is it? Shaw asked, already knowing the answer. A hatch, he said. Covered. He tapped the inside of the staircase, low where the curve met the floor. The sound changed. Stone, 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 and then a hunger in the tone, the clunk of hollow. Hidden well enough if you're not listening for it. The cover was the same paint as the wall, white once, now salt-bitten to gray, and edged with a skin of old caulk that had been painted over a dozen times. The handle wasn't a handle at all, but a recessed iron hoop, flush to the wood and gummy with brine-warped paint. Photos, Shaw said. The tech snapped the hatch in situ, then the rail above, then the surrounding seam where paint met stone. A second tech dusted the immediate area for prints. A third, crouched like a mechanic under the lowest step, ran a gloved fingertip around the hoop and came away with the tiniest smear of red-brown. He lifted his hand, eyebrows raised. Same color family, he murmured. We'll know more after testing. Pry it, Shaw said. Careful. They worked in quiet, professional time. The first pull lifted nothing. The second coaxed a creak like a throat clearing itself after not speaking for years. The caulk gave reluctantly, tearing in fibrous strings, then snapped with a sound that made everyone around the stair draw breath at once. The hatch lifted. Cold air pushed up, damp and old, carrying a smell that was neither holy sea nor holy rot, but the marriage of both. Salt and iron, mold and old metal. The opening was narrow, a square framed by old joists, edges beveled where hands had gone cautious. Shaw knelt and put her face to the dark. The torch beam found a brief blizzard of dust, then settled on stone steps that were not the lighthouse's spiral. Rough, chipped, direct, leading down into a space that the main stair had once been built on top of, the way a story gets built over a buried one. Grigg stood back, arms folded, as if the light might reach him and decide to speak. When Shaw looked up at him, he shook his head once, small and hard. "I don't go down there," he said. "It was here before me." "How long before?" "Always." He swallowed. "As far as my time knows." Shaw flicked her torch down again. The stair wasn't long, 12 treads, maybe, ending in a floor that looked like packed sand and crushed shell. The beam played along the right-hand wall and caught something that answered light oddly. Metal? She went first. It was her habit. The first step complained under her boot, the second less so, the third not at all. The space opened enough to stand without stooping. The ceiling was low, the kind that makes your shoulders want to rise. The lighthouse's foundations pressed down in weight and damp. "What we got?" she said quietly, and her voice didn't need the quiet to be answered. The room was already listening. Rusted chain lay in a tumble near the wall. Not lengths of anchor chain, but shorter runs, shackles in pairs, iron cuffs laid open like jaws that had forgotten their work. The links had fused in places where time and salt had wetted them. Flakes of orange-brown lay like sawdust, and in the kink of one shackle a residue had dried darker, a migraine stain even old rust couldn't pretend away. "Blood," the tech said, his voice flattened by the mask. "Dried. Aged. Some different ages, if I had to guess by the color variation. We'll lift samples." Shaw crouched, the grit biting through her trousers. The smell here was thicker, its layers more legible. Old water, iron, a dust of bone she told herself was shell. She knew the taste in the back of her throat now, knew how it made saliva climb. She let the torch travel. The left-hand wall was cut from stone that had been injured by tools and then licked smooth by air. Along its skin ran carvings so shallow they looked like watermarks until the light sat exactly right. Spirals, one nested within another. Humps and curls like the notations tide watchers make when they're trying to teach a future self what a night sea does. In, out, slack, turn. They weren't decorative. They were instructions written in a language older than the board minutes, more precise than pub talk. Some spirals had been recut where time had eaten them. Others ended abruptly as if the hand had been interrupted and never returned. Markings, one tech noted for his recorder. Non-letters, possibly symbolic. Photograph, said A. Raking light, scale marker. Get macros of the edges, Shaw said. Tool marks. The beam swept further, and the room answered with an object half buried in the packed sandness of the floor, a corner of wood emerging like a rib at low tide. Shaw dug with gloved fingers, gentle, then more insistent. A crate revealed itself. Old planking, dovetailed at the corners, the grain blackened and the nails gone fat with corrosion. It had a stenciled mark on one side, letters ghosted, unreadable, and a smear along the edge where paint had once been. The lid was gone. The inside was empty save for grit and the desiccated husk of a sea creature that had come here by mistake and left bones that were well designed for any century. Bag the slivers, she said. Lift the interior. Swabs on the rim. Tape for trace. Her brain populated the crate on its own. Statuary wrapped in tarred canvas, canvases rolled around staves, a brass something heavy enough to drag and valuable enough to hide. The shape of absence was specific. Inspector. The tech's light found the low ceiling's seam. A narrow fissure that ran diagonally and then narrowed to a heaven's hair. Salt had grown along it like frost. In one place, the crystals had thickened over a stain that had run down and then evaporated, leaving a dark tide line fanning on the stone. A moth's wing lay caught in it, years old. Above that seam, directly above, if her mental map was right, sat the lantern room. She turned the torch off for a heartbeat. The darkness pressed like a hand. She turned it back on before the pressure could become a thought. Map this, she said. Full set. Laser, grid, the lot. Behind her on the stair, Grigg's boots scraped once and then stopped. "It predates me," he said into the dark. "This room. It predates my father, too." "What did your father call it?" Shaw asked without looking at him. He didn't answer. She heard him swallow, a small sound soldiering through salt air. "We don't go in. That was the rule." "Who made the rule?" Silence. On the floor, a crab's dried carapace crackled under a tech's knee. The room breathed damp at them. The spirals on the wall watched the torch move like an old eye follows a fire. "You said you keep the lamp," Shaw said at last. Her voice the level one she used with witnesses who thought refusing terms would change facts. "What's this room for?" "Keeping other things," Grigg said, and then the words ran out. They worked for an hour under the lighthouse's ribs. Evidence bags took on labels, chain fragments, rust/residue, wooden crate, slivers, interior trace, carving surfaces, swab. A tech set a scale bar by the darkest bloom on the chain cuff and took stills that caught the iron as black rather than orange. Someone murmured LCV if we want, and Shaw shook her head. "Not yet. Take lifts first. We don't drown what we can carry." When she finally straightened, her knees sang complaint. Sand and fine salt made her boots sound unfamiliar, as if she had borrowed someone else's feet. She let the torch rest on the spirals again, following one from a tight dark center out through widening loops until it met a second spiral turning the other way. Interference patterns. Tide against tide. If you knew how to read it, it would tell you when to stand on the rocks and when to run. Back at the hatch, Grigg had retreated to the first landing. He stood with one hand on the rail, looking up, not down, as if memory preferred the light. Shaw climbed to him and held his gaze. "Predates you," she said, "but it belongs to your house." He said nothing. She took her phone, thumbed the camera, and descended again, composing each frame as if the act of making order with rectangles could make sense where there wasn't any. Chains, carvings, the fissures salt tatting, the crate's emptiness. A close-up of the sand floor where something heavy had dragged and left a suggestion of direction. Toward the far corner, where the wall darkened and then vanished into a low throat the torch refused to travel far into. When she came back up, she found the light at the door different. A thin sunny blade introduced by a moving cloud, a trick of day reminding the place it was noon somewhere. She drew the hatch closed and laid her palm on the painted wood. It was colder than the stair, colder even than the external wall, as if the room beneath held night like a liquid and shared it through contact. "Seal this," she told the senior tech. "For now. Evidence tape. Tamper indicator. No one in without me." The tech nodded and set about making the visible signs of invisible authority. Grigg stood his ground. "You'll drag ghosts into court," he said, and it wasn't scorn. It was fatigue. "What will you say when the room asks to take the oath?" "I'll say the room was here," Shaw said. "I'll show the jury where the chains say it was used, and the carvings say it meant something, and the crate says something left. I don't need the room to swear. The metal will." He turned his face a fraction toward her. "You're going to think this is about men smuggling art and calling it weather. Is it not?" He looked at the hatch. "It's about the sea asking what it's owed, and men inventing numbers." Shaw let that settle. Then she stepped past him into the white of the stairwell and breathed the cleaner damp. She pulled off her gloves and felt the telltale powdered dryness of salt on her fingertips as if she'd been handling snow. Outside, gulls wrote erratic punctuation above the tower. She walked into the square of wind that lived between lighthouse and cottage and lifted the phone again. Frames flicked by. Iron, grain, spiral cut shallow into stone. She selected the clearest of the carvings, scaled by a ruler's centimeters, and another of the crate's corner with the ghosted stencil. The images were the archaeology of a lie, or the anatomy of a ritual, maybe both. "Who's your best marine historian?" she asked the duty sergeant when he picked up, not waiting for greeting. "Someone who knows 19th century coastal practices and won't tell me stories they think I want to hear." He gave her a name and a number. She sent the first batch of photos with a short line, "Need identification. Marks in sub-foundation chamber of Blackwater Point Lighthouse? Possible tide notation / smuggler's code?" Also confirm crate type and chain usage. Then she sent the worst one, the iron cuff with its rust-black bloom, because sometimes you lead with the part that makes sense of the rest. As she hit send, the phone vibrated in her hand and asked if she wanted to compress the images. She told it no. Let the pixels carry their full weight. Grigg stood with his back to the door, face turned to weather. It was there before me, he said again, more helplessly this time, as if language were a small blanket against an old wind. I know, Shaw said. Shaw sends photos to Marine Historian. Part 9, Historian's Warning. The reply came faster than bureaucracy ever does. 10 minutes after Shaw sent the photos, her phone trilled with a number she didn't know and a voice that sounded like tobacco kept in a tweed pocket. Detective Shaw? Julian Armitage, Falmouth Maritime Studies. Your sergeant said you had something that looked like the 19th century arguing with a church crypt. That's one way to put it, Shaw said. She stepped into the lee of the cottage to be out of the wind. You have the images? I do. And before we start, if these are decorative, I'll eat my degree. Shaw glanced toward the tower, then back at the screen. What am I looking at? A tide grammar, Armitage said. Paper rustled softly on his end. Her photos printed and already dog-eared in his hands. Not letters, notations. See your image 3, the shallow spirals cut into the wall? Those aren't pretty. They're shorthand from captain's private logs and fishermen's daybooks before the hydrographic office codified symbols. A tight spiral out to an open loop like that. She heard a fingernail tap the photo. Means a rotary current or eddy. Dangerous water that will seize a boat's stern and spin it. Often written beside the word race in longhand. The race sets westerly on the flood. Your double spiral, where two meet and fight, marks interference, reflected surge off a headland. It says, in stone, do not be here when the tide turns. Shaw pictured the curls under her torch, the way they ran to a point and vanished. So whoever cut them was marking a hazard, or instructing an accomplice, Armitage said, because it is not normal to carve private symbols in a lighthouse foundation. Log marks belong in books, not on walls. You carve them in stone when you want people who know the code to read it in a hurry. Smugglers, Shaw said. That would be my guess. 19th century Cornwall had two religions, Methodism and avoiding excise. If you wanted a rendezvous queue on a coast that slips and slides, you used what your crews already knew, tide signs. Now, your image 7, the iron cuffs and chain. Those aren't naval issue. They're improvised, shore-made, used for holding, well, he cleared his throat. Holding people or things that want not to be held while you wait for water to give you an hour you can work in. People, Shaw repeated, flat. I can't prove that from a photograph, Armitage said, serious now. But I've handled enough from wreck sites and custom seizures to say these are not anchor chains or cargo lashings. The hinge plates are too small, the jaws too mean. And you've a bloom of old heme on one shackle there. Yes, I saw your scale. If that's modern, I'll be surprised. Shaw watched mist thicken and thin around the gallery rail. There's a crate half-buried down there. Dovetail corners, stenciling gone. Empty. Dovetailing and ghosted stencils put you in the right century. Empty means two things. Either someone broke it open and took what mattered, or something inside wept itself into the sand. But if we're being honest, detective, crates in caves under lights with carved tide signs usually mean contraband. Small, high value. Paintings rolled around rods, statuary heads, coins, instruments. Things that ride quietly in a dinghy and become money in a parlor. You're sure those spirals are log symbols? Shaw asked. Not folklore? Not someone playing at ritual. They're folk practice turned into code, Armitage said, which is how most working superstitions survive. As useful habits dressed in story so children obey them. And that brings me to your least comfortable image, the salt tatting along the fissure and the dark run. I'll say this carefully. Men who smuggled were good at theater. If your lighthouse was ever used to bleed, forgive me, to discourage witnesses and encourage silence, it would not be the first time men have staged a portent to mask a crime. You're saying the bleeding is a trick, Shaw said. I'm saying that in several coastal communities there was a superstition called paying the sea. Armitage said. Usually a pinprick across a palm, or a thumb rubbed raw and pressed to a keel, or a lamb cut at the throat and its blood let into the water at launch. A bargain. Give the sea a little and she takes less. Cruder versions, less savory, existed the further back you go. Rarely human, but rumors travel faster than boats, and smugglers were not above amplifying a whisper. If a tower dripped something red on a night when men knew better than to be abroad, it would help keep nosy eyes away and give them a cover tale if someone did see. Oh, that's the curse. Best you head home. Shaw's eyes went to the lens, invisible behind white day. We saw the beacon glow red. For 7 minutes. Ah, paper again. He had a pencil. She could hear it. An occulting light can be altered without damaging the optics. A hood, a slide, a pane. Some keepers in the bad old days did run private signals, illegal, of course, to boats offshore. Tinted slides existed for demonstration and training. A red wash for 7 minutes would be a damned elegant way to say now to anyone who knew to look, and an excellent way to put the fear of God into anyone who didn't. Grigg swears he never touches the lens at night. A careful man might not need to, Armitage said. A shade can be worked from the service gallery or a shutter thrown from a lower frame if someone engineered it. But that's mechanics. Your photographs tell me this. The marks under your floor are 19th century tide warnings. The chains tell me something or someone was restrained there. The crate tells me something once lived in that chamber beside salt and air, and it had an owner. The fissure beneath the lantern says any liquid above will find its way down, and any liquid below can find its way up when the pressure is right. Shaw heard herself ask, "And the blood?" He paused long enough for the gulls to make a comment on the line. "I'm a historian," he said at last. "I deal in patterns, not miracles. There are rituals that talk of blood paying debt to water. Sailors cut their thumbs. Fisher wives pricked a heel. There are darker tales I won't dress for radio. But in my experience, blood at a smuggler's site is often camouflage for theft, or the cost of keeping order, or the price men pay when they put law where it dislikes being." "You sound like you're trying not to say something." "I'm trying to keep to my lane," Armitage said, the tobacco in his voice roughened. "But I'll give you the warning in your subject line. If that chamber is part of a line that runs through a family, if keepers used a state asset to run private messages and hide private goods, you are picking at an old rope knotted by men with practice. They're dead now, most of them. Their habits aren't. You'll find cousins where you'd prefer colleagues. Meaning smugglers became shipping agents. Wreckers' sons became harbor committee chairs. A man who once took coin to look the other way now chairs the fundraising gala for the lifeboat. That isn't cynicism. It's genealogy." He exhaled. "Follow the paperwork as if you didn't know the sea existed. Find manifests. Track insurer names. Look for ships that declared nautical instruments and then failed to arrive. Your crate was built to carry something that can be itemized. What would you put in it if you were them?" "A brass instrument if I were lucky," Armitage said. "A chronometer or a surveyor's compass, naval provenance. Small enough to hide, valuable enough to kill for twice. Paintings are softer to stash but harder to keep dry under a lighthouse. A compass would sit in that box like a king." The word landed with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with agreement. Shaw felt, briefly, the warmth of something aligning. Roker's graphite ghost. Valiant compass? The rumors in Harry's office, the family name stitched to the tower. The case had begun to carry its own light. "Last thing," Armitage said, voice lower. "If the lighthouse ever truly bled, not staged, not theater, the only way I've seen similar staining inside masonry is from capillary action. Liquid forced through microfissures by pressure below. You have a cave? A channel? The tide could push fluid up and out. That doesn't explain where the fluid comes from. It does explain why it appears to come from the tower itself. A trick of plumbing and geology. Or not a trick at all, depending on how many names you want to write on your sample bags." "We'll dive it," Shaw said. "I didn't hear that," Armitage replied. "But when you do, remember this. Men built pretty stories over ugly functions so their children could sleep. If you strip the story and leave the function bare, the people who were grateful for the story get angry. They'll call it heritage. They'll call it slander. They might even call it blasphemy. Where your best paperwork? What about the red 7 minutes? Shaw asked, already moving toward the car. I'd call that an occulting signal used for private traffic, he said. And if you prove it, you will pry up floorboards in respectable offices. Thank you, Dr. Armitage. Julian, he said and sighed. And detective? If you find ledger pages missing, assume they didn't walk out on their own. The line clicked to the polite emptiness of a call ended before either party said goodbye. Shaw stood with the phone at her ear a moment longer, listening to a dial tone that sounded like surf when you hold a seashell wrong. She scrolled back through the photographs. Spirals, hazard signs disguised as prayer, chains, jaws meant for wrists or the next worst thing. The crate, a negative space in the shape of profit. A lighthouse, perfect engineering trained to bear witness, pressed into service as a stage. Men built this. Men could be found. She slid into the driver's seat and opened her notebook. On a blank page she wrote paper trail, sea trail. Then she drew a small box and inside it, Sable Finch, manifest, nautical instruments, insurer, North Atlantic, broker, shipowner of record. Below that, Royal Navy surplus sales 1889, private collector names, auction houses quiet enough to keep secrets. Underneath she added in a neat column the companies from Roker's Ghost page, Calder and Coastal, Turn Atlantic, Orion Wade, Pennine Global, Sable Finch Shipping. Beside Sable Finch she drew a ring. The wind shook the car lightly. Out beyond the lay-by, the tower had taken its place again against a sky the color of old tin. She pictured Roker at the upstairs window, elbows on the flaking paint, watching for a 7-minute red and making his own circles on a paper tide chart. He had been walking toward a box under a floor under a lens. Paper first, she said aloud, as if committing in front of a witness. Then water. Shaw traces shipping manifests linked to the wreck. Part 10, cargo that never surfaced. The county record office smelled like dust that had learned to behave. Shaw signed for a gray archive box with Blackwater. Shipping agents, assorted. Penciled on the spine and carried it to a table under a strip light that insisted on flickering only when she looked straight at it. Inside, manila folders leaned like houses in a windswept street. She took them one by one, Calder and Coastal Marine, Turn Atlantic Freight, Orion Wade Carriers, Pennine Global, and a thin, mean folder stamp Sable Finch Shipping that looked like it had spent years pretending not to exist. Bills of lading are not written to be interesting. They are written to be obeyed. Shaw flattened one beneath her palm and read the tidy lies of commerce. Shipper, consignee, marks and numbers, description of goods. Assorted nautical instruments repeated down a column, each line married to a crate number. C7, C8, C9. The kind of vagueness that makes customs men sigh and thieves smile. She glanced at the weight column and felt the small lift in her chest that comes when a pattern blinks. For instruments, the declared masses were wrong. Heavy, not outrageously so, just enough to suggest brass and glass dents as gilt. And the dimensions, dovetailed boxes that would fit a chronometer's gimbals, a compass bowl, a sextant in its velvet throat. Nautical instruments was a coat a better word had put on to walk through daylight. She photographed the page, then the shipping agent's letter stapled behind it. Private exhibition, marine heritage, loan items, handle with care. No list of provenance where a diligent clerk would normally paste a museum's smug assurance. Instead, a paragraph of soft phrases that meant don't look too hard. In Orion Wade's folder, she found the movement order. The Finch to load at Newlyn, call at Blackwater to collect delayed pieces, then north with the tide. The delayed pieces had no separate bill. Someone had typed as above in the description field, then erased the carbon, then typed it again. She slid the page into an evidence sleeve before the ink could think about becoming the past. Her phone buzzed. The supervisor from North Atlantic Indemnities had picked a table in a cafe over the road where the coffee tasted like impatience. He arrived in a suit that was trying to ignore the sea's existence and a tie that had gone a little tragic at the knot. "Miss Shaw," he said, sitting with a wince that made his chair wish it were elsewhere. "I'm Daniel Crace. You called about Mr. Roker. She watched the man decide how much truth to put out. He was working something connected to the Sable Finch, she said. Tell me what your files don't. Crace's mouth made the shape of we'd prefer to cooperate fully before his brain had time to say don't. He folded his hands. The company had an open cargo policy for certain clients. Floating cover, declarations per shipment, for the Finch's consignment. He spread his fingers like a man showing he had nothing up his sleeves. No declaration was ever made. No certificate issued. No premium taken. When she went down, no one lodged a notice of loss with us. Meaning the shipment wasn't insured. Meaning, he said carefully, no one wanted the shipment insured. There was a placeholder on our ledger, a file started, a number reserved, then crossed through. Mr. Roker hated placeholders. They itch the way a missing rung itches when you go down a ladder in the dark. Who was the client? Crace smiled with nothing in it. If there had been one, I wouldn't tell you in a cafe. But since there wasn't, officially, we are in the odd position of having no duty of confidentiality regarding a non-existent declaration. Try that again. On paper, he said. There was nothing. Off paper, the name Calder and Coastal floats through emails like a buoy. And an intermediary calling itself the Marine Heritage Committee. No charity number, no accounts. Mr. Roker believed a private collector was using the phrase nautical instruments as code for objects with awkward provenance. Stolen. Crace didn't flinch, which told her he had flinched earlier, with someone else. Or looted historically and then laundered via generous loans. He found a whisper about a brass surveyor's compass, Royal Navy issue 18th century, slated to travel under that code of words. He wrote Valiant Compass on a yellow sticky and left it on my desk like a dare. HMS Valiant, Shaw said. The word felt right under her tongue, like a name you've been turning toward for days. A survey ship. Lost with all hands, Crace said. 1798 Western approaches. The sort of tale our underwriting men like to mention at conferences when they need a dash of salt in the room. The compass was said to have been recovered in the late 19th century from a wreck of no consequence, which is what men say when a wreck is of considerable consequence to a museum they do not want writing letters. Rumors of a curse, Shaw said, because sometimes you set the word down to see which way the other person's mouth tilts. He didn't laugh. Oh, certainly. Owners die at sea. Salvagers follow. Collectors have a run of bad health and a priest who talks about covetousness. Mr. Roker collected the ghastly anecdotes the way some men collect cigarette cards and then crossed most of them out. He liked facts more. Facts like no claim filed, in a case where an honest man would have had a check in his breast pocket before the lifeboat was ashore. Shaw let the cafe's clatter fold around them. So why come down here? Because a manifest that lies uses the word instruments, and an insurer that's being played has a hole in its accounts the shape of a crate. Because local men remember what the water does when the moon fails to show, and because your lighthouse is a stage with a trapdoor. Crace studied his spoon. And because James Roker had a habit of being right just before he made someone angry. Who? He shook his head. Someone who doesn't file claims, Inspector. Someone who files accounts receivable. She thought of the empty crate under the tower, the stenciling ghosted, the sand bearing the drag mark toward a dark corner the torch wouldn't travel far into. If someone meant to salvage privately, she said, they'd keep the insurance quiet to prevent an official tug turning up to have opinions. Exactly. He pushed his cup away, appetite finished. They'd sink the cargo under a name that wouldn't stick to the ledger, pull it up at leisure, and sell it into a world that never asks where a thing learned to be valuable. And Roker was coming for the compass. He was coming for the paperwork that proves it ever existed, Crace said. Paper hurts men who hide behind old stone better than a diver does. Back at the archive table, Shaw moved through the stack with the rhythm of a trawlerman working a net. Steady, no flourishes, take what the sea yields. In Calder and Coastal's correspondence, she found a letter on embossed paper. We note delay in release of the instruments from loaning party pending valuation. In the margin, a discreet hand had written, use Sable Finch, fewer eyes. She bagged the letter and its envelope. In Pennine Global's folder, a typed memo, Transport case C7, brass survey compass, RN. To be handled flat, no tilt. Someone had later drawn a line through RN. Not erased. Drawn through. She photographed that, too. The Sable Finch shipping folder held almost nothing. A rate card with numbers that didn't add up unless you knew which favors they bought. And a single carbon of a manifest the color of bad tea. She read it anyway, because sometimes the thing trying to be dull is where the heat leaks. Crate C7, instruments nautical, brass. Quantity, 1. Crate C8, instruments nautical, glass. Quantity, 3. Crate C9, instruments nautical, mixed. Quantity, 1. Beside C7, a faint pencil had once written something and been rubbed until it was almost nothing. She tilted the paper to the light and caught the ghost. A V and an A married in haste. The rest gone. She lifted the page, slid white card under, and tilted again until the letters stood up like bones through skin. VL, and then the rub-out ended in a smear like someone correcting a thought too late. She filed the evidence with the care of a person feeding a small, hungry thing. The file in her hand was beginning to speak the same language as Pendrow's ledger, the public phrases and the private gloss. Instruments where relics belonged. Delay where theft was in the room. No claim where we meant it to drown. She drove to the quay and found Harry on the steps of the office rolling a cigarette he had no intention of actually lighting. "If you were to steal something old and brass," she said by way of hello, "and you didn't want to explain it to a museum, what would you call it on a manifest?" "Instruments," he said without needing to think. "Or fixtures. Or my favorite, heritage loan." "Why?" "Because a box labeled C7 brass survey compass, RN, was loaded onto the Finch and then renamed Instruments when the carbon went to file." Harry's eyes went to the lighthouse and did not come back. "And you're going to ask me where C7 might have ended if no one filled out the form telling the Crown to look for it. I'm going to ask you where men with a small boat could work a winch without the headlands seeing them." He pointed, a small, grim crescent of a gesture. "Back of the point, in the lee, there's a place we call the Teeth. Old quarry cut. You could haul a piano out of there if you had the right swear words." She pictured the crate under the hatch and the fissure in the ceiling with salt feathering its edge. "They hauled something," she said. "Maybe not once. In the evening, the gulls went for a mercy quiet." Shaw spread her notes across the bed in the station flat and built a city of paper. The ledger's dates, the manifest's euphemisms, the blank space on the microfilm where men had said what they'd seen. Roker's rubbed list with valiant compass, underlined until the paper begged for mercy. She drew a line through time. 1798. Lost with all hands. 1889. Salvage whispered. Curse-born. 1901. Bleed recorded. 2 decades ago. The Finch drowns with instruments that look like relics. Now, Roker comes to draw the circle closed. The phone lit her ceiling with an alert she had set out of habit. Not belief. Black tide forecast window. She taught the app a different calendar. It had learned. Next, 48 hours. She lay back and imagined the tower running with red for 7 minutes while the water drank the sky. A compass warm to the touch the way brass is when hands won't leave it be. Men staging portents and finding, to their surprise, that sometimes a thing stops pretending and begins to act like itself. Roker had been here to find a relic and the paper that could push it back into a world where it could be named. He had written Valiant Compass and drawn circles around 3 nights. His body had been given back to the rocks. Shaw clicked off the lamp and let the dark bring its sea sounds in. The case felt like a map that wanted to fold itself into a smaller shape and hide. She would not let it. Paper first, then water. Next black tide is 48 hours away. Part 11, Locals in the Dark. By late afternoon, the town had pulled its curtains halfway across its face. Shaw walked the lanes where cottage doors sit almost on the road and knocked until her knuckles knew which paint was new and which had given up. At the first door, a fishmonger's wife wiped her hands on her apron and said she hadn't heard the lighthouse say anything since they electrified it. At the second, a boy with a dog said his granddad used to keep stories in a tobacco tin, but the tin went in the skip when the house was cleared. At the third, A man in a cable knit looked at the photo on Shaw's ID as if it were the thing asking the questions, then shut the door with a gentleness that was still a refusal. She learned the choreography quickly. Mention the body, hear condolences. Mention the lighthouse, watch eyes drift off. Mention a relic, and the room itself seemed to lean away. The word had weight here, not museum weight, church weight. The lane took on that hush towns get when they don't want to be heard answering. At the school hall, where a notice board still carried a faded harvest supper poster, the caretaker paused his sweeping long enough to say that the light always did what it ought, except when it didn't, then asked whether this was going to close the cliff path for the summer. People won't like that, he said. Even if it's the sea doing it, they won't like it from you. Back at the widow's lantern, the landlord polished a glass that didn't need it and told Shaw that no one here had room for curses anymore. Rents are curse enough. Then glanced toward the far end of the bar where a tiny woman in a neat coat drank black tea with a lemon slice and looked straight at Shaw, the way old people do when they have already decided whether to speak. Her hair was white as blown spray. Her handbag sat on her lap like a small animal that had learned to sit. Agnes Palglace, the landlord said, without moving her lips. Her father worked the mole. Don't say I sent you. Shaw crossed. Mrs. Palglace? I'm Eleanor Shaw. I know who you are, Agnes said, in a voice that had dried into something useful. Sit. Shaw did and folded her hands like a student. The pub noise went on around them but seemed to skip their table. I'm sorry to ask you about things you'd rather have left alone, Shaw began. You're not sorry, Agnes said, not unkindly. You just know I'm old enough to remember and too old to be frightened by you. She sipped her tea. What is it you want? The clean version or the one people only say when they think God's washing his hands? The one your father told you, Shaw said. Agnes set the cup down and held the saucer in both hands as if warming them. He came home one night with his eyes full of the lighthouse, she said. Not the way men get when they're proud of it. The other way. Said the tower had wept red like a woman who's been struck and can't show the mark. He watched it from the mole. Said it ran down in lines as straight as a plum, warm as blood ought to be, and it fell into the sea and the sea took it as if it had been waiting. Agnes's eyes were on the fire now, not Shaw. After, the water laid itself down like a sheet. He said you could hear the quiet banging against the rocks. That's how calm it went. The boats went out next day without a prayer for once. That's when I learned the saying. What saying? That when the light bleeds, it means the sea is owed. She turned her head and looked at Shaw as if to be sure the words had been heard with their proper shape. You don't need to be a poet to understand it. You just need to have buried people. Shaw held her eyes. Owed what? Agnes smiled with her mouth only. That's the part the living argue about. Your father believed it? He believed in the weather and in the debt men make by being careless. She lifted her tea and took another measured sip. Some debts are coin, some are flesh. Sometimes the sea takes one so it won't take many. Sometimes men believing that is the only way they can stand up in the morning. And the relic? Shaw asked. The compass. Agnes gave a tiny shrug. We don't keep compasses in our house, Inspector. We watch the wind. If there is a thing under that tower that points at trouble, I expect the trouble already knows where we live. Shaw let the silence happen. Agnes placed the cup down, aligned its handle with the saucer's chip, and then said as if reciting a list she had promised herself she would never speak. Robert Grigg made a payment once. The words were small and heavy. Shaw didn't move. Thomas's father. Agnes's look said, you already knew which Grigg I meant. The year the Finch went down, she said. The men talk about fog and poor engines and crates that weren't what they said they were. But that winter the sea had been queer. Eating boats and leaving their ropes. Throwing back things no one could name. After the bleed, we had a run of safe months you could count on one hand. Weather minds its manners some seasons and some it doesn't. That year it minded. We said there'd been a payment. Quietly. In kitchens. What kind of payment? Shaw's voice was a thread. Agnes looked past her, over her shoulder, at the brickwork, at the photograph of the first lifeboat crew lined up like a string of beads. You think if I say it out loud it'll become the sort of thing a woman in a coat says in a pub? That it'll live in your notebook and become somebody's exhibit. She shook her head. I won't give you a word you can put in a charge. I'm not here for theater, Shaw said. No, Agnes said. But it will be, once you've said it into a microphone. She patted her bag. My father said not all debts are paid by choice. Some are paid the way rocks pay the sea, by being there when it comes. A man can stand on a cliff and call it a sacrifice if it helps him sleep. You're telling me Robert Grigg killed someone, Shaw said. Not as an accusation, but as a translation. I'm telling you we had calm water when we needed it and a keeper who left his post after. Agnes's mouth straightened. A payment is a story we tell to put shape around the thing you can't look at. Maybe it's easier to believe he meant it. Maybe it's worse if he didn't. And you won't say what that payment was. Agnes's hands were small on the saucer. No. Why? Because words travel faster than tides, she said. And because Thomas Grigg has to sleep in that cottage with the tower listening. He was a boy when his father went. He's a man now, and men do what they know how to do. He keeps the light. That's his business with God. The landlord drifted past to collect a glass and left them a piece of quiet. Outside, the afternoon had decided to dim early. Shaw thanked Agnes and stood. Inspector, Agnes said as she slipped the bag's strap over her shoulder. If you sit with the cliff tonight, don't sit where the old path falls away. It likes people there. I'll keep to the gorse, Shaw said. Good, Agnes said, and gave a small nod that might have been a blessing if there had been a priest to witness it. You mind the 7 minutes? Shaw stepped back into the street where the wind had found another gear. As she walked, doors she'd knocked on earlier stayed closed. A man she'd asked about the relic now studied the ground as if the answer might be written there. On the harbor wall the tide had just turned, the long slack between breaths over. The lighthouse, half erased by mist, looked domestic, almost kind. She knew better than to trust appearances. At the station she signed out a field kit and a thermal mug, then drove without lights until the last bend before the point. The cliff path took her boots the way an old path does, showing familiar stones under wet grass. She picked a hollow between gorse and thrift that held the wind without giving her away and settled in. Binoculars in reach, camera on a knee, radio low. From here the tower was a white knife shape between 2 ribs of rock. The gallery rail made a square as thin as a fingernail. The sea below laid itself out in slow bands, darker on the turn. Her phone screen threw the slightest glow on her hand when she checked the time. An hour to full dark. Enough for the fishermen to finish tying knots they didn't need to tie. Enough for the town to close the day around itself. Enough for a woman in a neat coat to put her teacup in the sink and open the window to listen whether the water was saying anything new. Shaw pulled her collar up and waited. Gulls worked the last of the light, then thought better of it and went inland. The tower kept its counsel. Somewhere behind her a sheep coughed. A sound so domestic it made the hair along her arms remember what else the night could be. She breathed slow and steady. She would keep her eyes on the lamp and the door and the seam of wall where the red runs had dried. She would mind the 7 minutes. Shaw keeps watch that night. Part 12, the night stakeout. Shaw settled into the hollow she'd chosen. A cradle of gorse and thrift with room enough for a breath and a decision. The cliff dropped away 30 feet in front of her. Beyond that the Atlantic arranged itself in slow, muscular bands. Gray on gray, then began, almost imperceptibly, to thicken. Moonless sky bled down into the water until horizon and sea made a single, depthless plate. The black tide didn't arrive with a flourish. It arrived by subtraction, taking the world's light one tone at a time until the color left and only weight remained. She checked her watch, then palmed the binoculars and let the lighthouse fill the glass. The tower was a white subtraction against a darker nothing. No movement at the door. No figure on the gallery. Wind combed the heather flat, making the gorse whisper like wool on stone. The radio on her shoulder murmured once. The duty sergeant confirming the forensic techs were staged 100 yards inland, downslope, engine cold, waiting on her word. She clicked once in reply. The case had eaten enough noise. She would give it none tonight. Time elongated. The sea's voice changed from break to breath, from crash to draw, as if something big had rolled over in its sleep. Shaw steadied her view on the lantern room. The optics were dark, a geometry of glass inside black. She could taste salt on her teeth. She breathed slow, measuring patience against weather. A dull pulse stuttered in the lens. Once, then again. Then the glass flowered red. It wasn't the thin wash of a warning beacon. It was a saturation. A blood color poured through the crystal steps so that every rib of the Fresnel took on a bruise and threw it back at the night. The gallery rail turned wine-dark. The panes took on the shade of a closed eye. Shaw's watch hand moved 1 minute, then 2. She counted under her breath without meaning to, a litany of seconds. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. At the 3rd minute, something answered below. Lines appeared on the white masonry, thin at first, then thickening, running true from a seam below the gallery and another at the shoulder of the tower. They didn't bloom like paint. They issued with intention, gathering into narrow rivers that sought the vertical, learning the wall's small contours and taking them. At the base, where stone met rock and rock met air, the lines stepped over the edge and became sound. Irregular taps against the ledge, quick as a clock with a bad conscience, then slower as drops lengthened with their own weight. The smell came up on the next wind. Iron, raw enough to cut through salt. Shaw kept the binoculars level and swung them once to the door. Shut, no movement. Then to the stairs windows, empty, then back to the lens. The red held like a held breath. For minutes. 5, 6, 7. On the 7th minute, as precisely as a clock obeying a geometry, the color thinned and the lamp's ghost returned to clear. The tower shed no more light than a cloud. The red withdrew from the glass as if something had unclenched. She slid the binoculars down, moved low along the path she'd mapped in daylight, a zigzag of sheep track and stubborn grass, and dropped to the lower shelf that brought her within a handful of yards of the base. The fishermen would call her a fool. The sea took issue with being given its dues on its own nights. Tonight she would take hers. "Go," she said into the radio, voice flat. Behind her, over the lip of the path, 2 figures in dark kit began their careful descent. Forensics, moving like men on a church floor who had been told not to look up. Shaw reached the ledge, crouched, and watched the lines of red learn the rock's angles. She let a drop plash onto the stone and instantly set a sterile microtube beneath the next one. Catching it, capping it, labeling it by feel. BWPLH/EXT/seam A, 017, ambient 8 degrees Celsius. Another tube under another run. Seam B. She felt the warmth through gloves and plastic. Not ambient, not wind-chilled, fresh. A tech to her left swabbed a run onto gauze and slid it into a labeled sleeve. Another held out a contactless thermometer and took a reading an inch from the falling thread, then another from the stone it struck. The numbers weren't necessary. The human body knows when blood is warm. Photographing, the senior tech murmured. The tower's base flashed with tight, disciplined light, 1, 2, 3 frames per seam, raking angle to catch the flow's thickness, scale markers pinned to stone with tiny magnets. Shaw moved with the rhythm they knew together. Catch, cap, label, bag. Keep the chain of custody clean under the world's dirtiest ceiling. The smell of iron thickened. She could feel the saliva rise in her mouth the way it does in a boxing ring nosebleed. Above them, the gallery stayed empty. No shadow crossed the panes. No hinge side at the door. No footstep complained on the 4th stair. Shaw looked anyway because part of you always wants a face to blame. The tower gave her stone and glass and the absence that has its own kind of courage. They worked fast. The run from seam A faltered, then steadied. Seam B thinned to a scatter of drops like punctuation. One path of red wandered toward a hairline in the masonry and disappeared into it, as if the tower were relearning its own veins. Shaw caught a last drop in a cap, then sat back on her heels and let herself breathe. "Initial hemistics positive," a tech said softly, glancing down at the green strip that had gone a satisfying blue. "We'll confirm in the lab, but it's blood," Shaw finished. She didn't bother to keep triumph out of her voice. The night had earned her a line. She looked out along the rock platform to the right, where Spindrift lifted in quick, bright ghosts and vanished. No movement there either, save the sea's old choreography. She raised the binoculars and panned one last time. Door, windows, gallery, then dropped them and checked her watch. 7 minutes were over. The tower had gone back to being a tower. The lines on its side would brown by morning and be called rust by men who needed that word more than they needed sleep. They withdrew the way they had come, careful as thieves who meant to leave everything exactly as they'd found it except the truth. At the top of the path, out of the spray's reach, Shaw set the tubes in a foam rack and sealed the rack in a secondary bag. The labels glowed under her torch. BWPLH/EXT/Seam A 017. Seam B 018. Runoff, ledge 019. She ran a finger down the ink. The handwriting stayed itself. Scene log updated, the senior tech said. Chain intact. Courier on standby. Shaw nodded. Add one more note. Observation. No human figure entering or leaving the lighthouse during event window. She paused, then added for herself, not the record. And the light knows its own time. She turned once more toward the tower. In the weak spill from her torch, the red on the wall had already lost its theater and become the kind of brown that stone forgives. The night behind it was total. She felt the oddest tug, as if the place were relieved to be finished with its part, like a stagehand dropping a curtain and going for a cigarette. The radio hissed, the courier's engine turning over in the lay-by, the lazy click of a mic keyed and unkeyed by a driver trying not to fidget. Shaw handed over the rack, watched the case go into a cooler box, watched that box go into anonymous plastic in the boot. When the car pulled away, its red tail light looked, for 3 irrational seconds, like the lamp had decided to follow its own color down the road. Then it turned a corner and was ordinary again. She stood alone a moment longer and let the black tide speak to her the way it spoke to men who had spent their lives pretending they didn't listen. Somewhere out beyond the headland, interference patterns were knitting and unknitting themselves in the dark. Somewhere under her boots, an old chamber held chains that had forgotten what they were for and a crate that hadn't forgotten at all. And above, a lens that could color its own truth for 7 minutes without lifting a finger. Shaw packed her kit and slid the straps home with the muscle memory of 1,000 scenes and none like this. She felt the stubborn relief that comes when the world does the thing you feared it wouldn't do when asked to in front of witnesses. The case had been waiting for tonight to speak in a language paper could translate. On the way back along the cliff path, a gust shouldered her into the gorse and then relented, as if the headland were reminding her of the terms. She touched the radio. Control, Shaw. Samples collected at Blackwater Point Lighthouse. Courier en route. Secure refrigerator on standby. She hesitated, then added, event window observed. 7 minutes continuous red occultation. Fluid issuing from seams in exterior masonry. No personnel access observed. Received, the sergeant said. Do you want a patrol to sit the point? Let it sleep, Shaw said. We've taken enough from it for one night. Back in the car, she set the heater to low and let her hands remember they had been cold. The dash clock ticked itself into tomorrow. She closed her eyes and saw, bright as afterimage, the red glass and the thin lines running true down the wall. 7 minutes. A human number for a thing that liked counting. Her phone breathed light. A message from the lab, automated, samples received 112. Priority processing initiated. She tapped the screen dark again and let the engine idle. The lighthouse stood patient in the mirror, its white diminished by weather and distance until it had the soft lie of innocence. She drove slow back toward the town that had pulled its curtains. Somewhere behind one of those windows, Agnes Palglace would be listening to the quiet her father had promised her came after the red. Somewhere on a different road, Thomas Grigg would be awake in a house that kept the same breath as a tower. Somewhere, in an archive that pretended to be modern, a strip of microfilm would still be white where men's words had been cut away. Tonight she had taken words the sea couldn't erase and put them in plastic where paper would join them in the morning. Sample results show DNA from multiple people. Part 13 DNA puzzle. The lab rang at 7:12, early enough to make the day feel complicit. Shaw was in the station kitchen burning toast she didn't want when the ringtone turned the room's hum into a summons. She took it in the corridor, facing a window that showed the sea as a flat conviction. "Detective Shaw," said a woman with clipped kindness. "Dr. Alice Morgan, Regional Forensic Biology. I have your lighthouse samples." Shaw felt herself stand a little straighter. "Go on." "We've completed preliminary DNA typing on seam A, seam B, and the runoff ledge tubes. Short version, you have mixed human profiles in all three. Not one victim, several." "How many is several?" "At minimum," Morgan said. "For unique contributors across the set. 2 major, 2 minor. The distribution changes by tube, which is consistent with, well, with a plumbing metaphor I'm not thrilled to use. But the important part is this. 3 of the 4 profiles match missing person references in the database with high confidence." Shaw shut her eyes briefly. "Who?" Tom Berryman," Morgan said, reading. "Reported overboard, Penwith, 1973. Familial reference from a sister. Match via YSTR and autosomal. Joseph Morley, body recovered Pendine, 1927. Exhumed bone sample was typed 10 years ago for a historical project. Partial but significant concordance. A beat. And an unidentified male from 2003, Paran Cove. Family reference unknown, but we have his original blood card. Full profile match." Shaw stared at the blank window until it showed her face back like a reprimand. "You're telling me blood that ran down a wall last night carries DNA from men dead decades?" "I'm telling you that's what the alleles say." Morgan's voice did not flinch. "The 4th contributor is not in any database we have. It could be your recent decedent, Mr. Roker. We'll need his reference sample from postmortem to confirm. But 3 hits spanning nearly a century is not natural." "Under natural conditions," Shaw said, to feel the phrase in her mouth. "That's impossible." "Quite. Blood cells lyse. DNA fragments. Environmental exposure accelerates both. So we look to explain the paradox. 2 more items may help." She shuffled paper. "We screened for non-human material. All samples contain a distinct suite of marine microorganisms, diatoms and bacteria, that, in combination, match water taken from 30 meters down off Blackwater Point in an Environment Agency survey 2 summers ago. Not surface plankton. A deeper, more stable community. You also have very fine silt in suspension. Grain size and mineral signature suggest an offshore gully." Shaw pictured the fissure under the lantern room, salt crystals feathering its edge. "So the fluid has, at some stage, been at 30 meters depth." "That's the inference," Morgan said. "And the human DNA shows variability in degradation patterns that imply different ages. If blood from multiple donors was somehow stored cold and dark, underwater, say, and forced through microfractures by pressure changes, you could get the mixture we're seeing. It's an ugly hypothesis. It fits your facts. A click somewhere down the line, as if the lab itself had stepped closer. Detective, I'm not given to poetry, but whatever your tower is doing, it's moving old names through a new night." Shaw let the words find their level inside her. "Old names through a new night. Thank you, Dr. Morgan. One more question. Temperature. Runoff at collection was above ambient. Your field note says you felt that. Lab readings confirm. That speaks to recent emergence, not relic staining. Someone or something pushed it up last night." When the call ended, the corridor held its breath and then let it out again, as if relieved to have been mere plaster during the conversation. Shaw wrote the names in her notebook with a blunt pencil. Berryman, 73. Morley, 27. U/male, 03. Unknown, prob broker. She underlined 30M microorganisms twice, then drew a line from that to fissure under lantern, capillary action, and another to chamber under stair, low throat to seaward. The facts made a shape whether she wanted them to or not. The chamber beneath the stair was not the whole of it. There was a second space, the ocean side of the foundation, a cavity or cave taking the tide, a pressure lung that inhaled black tide and exhaled. "What?" Det said Agnes. "Camouflage," said Armitage. "For names," said the lab. Shaw took the road to the point before the town could finish its first mugs of tea. The lighthouse rose out of a morning that had decided to be indifferent. Grigg was on the lee side of the cottage, hammering a warped latch back into obedience. He looked like a man who had not slept and had not found a good reason why he should have. She gave him the headline without drama. The lab found more than one person in last night's blood. 3 matches, Berryman, Morley, the 2003 John Doe. A 4th likely Roker. All of it carried microlife from 30 meters down off this headland. He stared past her shoulder at the tower as if waiting for it to shrug. You're telling me the light keeps a ledger. I'm telling you the sea does. She let the pause form. There's a cave under this foundation that's open to depth. The fissure in your floor is a throat. On the black tide, pressure pushes whatever is pooled below up through the seams. The tower's bleeding names back, he said, in a small voice that hadn't asked to leave his throat. He turned the hammer in his hand until it had no comfortable side. Inspector, if you go talking like that in the lane, men will have to choose between their god and their dinner. We'll talk like engineers in the lane, she said. In here, we'll talk like people who don't want any more bodies. She walked him inside and put her notes on the small table like a map. There's an offshore gully. The Environment Agency water sample suggests it. We need to see the base of this rock from the waterside. A dive at slack. Grigg made the face of a man assessing a weather window on a bad day. Tide turns at 11:40 today. Slack is mean and brief. The black tide proper tomorrow night. Today is recon, Shaw said. We look, we don't touch. Coast Guard team, dry suits, rope to a surface tender. I want eyes on any cavity at the foot of the tower and any tunnel that communicates with your subfloor. He let out a breath through his nose. I've heard about that cave since I had milk teeth. Men say it pulls things in and keeps them like a miser. Men say it talks. They all say men say until someone goes down. She lifted the radio. Then the sea says, and we listen. By 10, the cove to the east of the point held a red and white RIB nosing the weed line and a Coast Guard crew who had been told only as much as their courage required. Harry Tregear stood with a clipboard he didn't need, the brisk in his voice a way to keep old stories out of the air. The wind had favored them. Waves smoothed to a patient run along the rocks. The water's surface had that particular polish that makes divers' hands jealous. Slack in 20, Harry said. You get 15 minutes before she starts to turn in earnest. If there's a throat under there, it'll breathe when the tide does. You want to be looking when it inhales, not when it coughs. Shaw watched the 2 divers kit up. Black seals being fitted to wrists, masks checked, regulators purged with small dragon snorts. She briefed them shorter than their training recommended. Follow the east wall to the tower base. Look for a crevice or cave mouth. Mark any outflow. Do not enter a tunnel fully. Tie off a line at the lip. Keep it singing. If you see anything that looks like a container or human remains, you mark and you back out. We'll come again with a plan. They nodded the way professionals nod when work asks them to be sensible. Grigg stood a little apart, eyes narrowed against glare, jaw set as if he'd been given something to carry and had accepted it by instinct. The divers dropped backwards into green. Shaw followed their bubbles along the rock, the foam patterns drawing arrows briefly and then losing interest. She listened, one hand on the tender's rail, as if sound would tell her when the sea's lungs had reached the bottom of the breath. The radio on Harry's shoulder crackled. The divers clipped vowels flattened by water and technology. At the base, visibility 2 to 3 meters. Following wall. Stand by, we have a slot. Narrow, vertical, descending to a cavity. Looks natural, some dressed edges. Pause. There's a current, subtle, drawing in. Shaw looked at Harry. He didn't look back. He was watching the water skin like a man reading a face. Approaching entrance, the diver said. Marking with strobe, entering 1 body-length floor is sand and crushed shell. There's an outflow stain on the ceiling. Iron red. Looks recent. And the voice changed, not panicked so much as startled into honesty. Bones. Human. Long bones. Clean. Knife scoring on 1. Shaw hit the transmit without thinking. Back out. Mark position. Do not disturb. Confirm you heard. Copy. backing out. Strobe remains fixed. A beat. Detective. There are crate fragments down here. Dovetail corner like your photo. And a pause long enough for history to lay a hand on the back of her neck. A glint wedged in a fissure. Brass. Round. We're not touching it. Shaw let out the breath she had been hoarding. You'll come up now. As they surfaced, the tide did what Harry had said it would. It paused, indecisive, as if considering manners, and then began to take itself back out to where it felt at home. The divers rolled into the RIB with controlled clumsiness, faces bright where the mask had been. One held up a finger sheathed in neoprene. Your cave's there, he said, and it's got a throat to your tower, sure as you like. When it turns, you can feel it pull. On the rock, Grigg had gone very still, the kind of stillness that isn't calm so much as absence, the body making room for a thing it can't name. He met Shaw's eyes and nodded once. A truce between language and salt. She made the next calls from the harbor steps, where gulls scolded bureaucracy without caring who heard. Scenes of crime. Marine unit. A coroner who had learned to suppress adjectives. She kept her sentences strictly terrestrial. Submarine cavity located. Evidence of human remains. Structural communication with subfoundation. She never said the tower bleeds old names. That was for the part of her brain that filed under not for statements. When she hung up, the day had acquired the crispness of a plan. Paper had led to water, and water had shown her a door. Behind it lay the rest of the ledger in a language everyone would understand. Bone, wood, brass. She looked once at the lighthouse, at the gallery that had flushed red for 7 minutes as steady as a metronome. There would be more to take from it tomorrow night. But the next step belonged to the sea. Prepares dive with Coast Guard. Part 14, the cave beneath. They went at slack, the sea holding its breath between moods. The RIB nosed along the east face of the point until the rock learned to be vertical and the weed thinned to bare stone. The strobe the divers had left earlier winked like a small, stubborn star a meter inside the slot they'd marked. Shaw sat hip to hip with Harry on the tube, mask on her thighs, watching the surface polish itself into something almost polite. The divers dropped as one and slid toward the crevice, black seals against the pale of the stone. Shaw followed this time, a line from her harness clipped to the tender and a second line tied to the strobe carabiner. She let the descent be slow and unromantic, equalizing like a metronome, counting the beats until the rock became her weather. The water was 3 degrees warmer than she'd expected. Under the ledge, the world stepped down into green gloom and then into a throat of slate. The crevice took them shoulder-wise. Shaw felt the squeeze over her tank and the slide of her own exhalations along her face. One frog kicked, two, and the slot made a small curtsy and widened. The cave received them. A low chamber, sand and shell dressed flat by centuries of water. The far wall pitted where bubbles had worried at weakness and won. Her torch found the first thing by accident. A rectangle in the sand where corners refused to soften. Dovetail joinery nosed up out of grit like bone at low tide. She brushed with her glove and the corner of a crate showed itself. Plank swollen and black, a ghost of stenciling that had forgotten its name. 7 maybe, or the hint of a V that hesitated at being seen. Beside it, a plank edge lay like a snapped rib, iron nails fat with corrosion. The sand held the absence of more. The second thing announced itself by smell even underwater. Iron old enough to have given up being metal and become color. Shackles lay in a loose heap where someone's deliberate hand had once made order and time had unmade it. Paired jaws with hinge plates as mean as memory, short lengths of chain fused into sculpture by rust. One cuff was choked with the delicate skeleton of a crab, its empty eye cups staring perfect and dumb. In the kink of another lay a bloom of something darker in the iron's throat. Shaw steadied her breathing. Her world narrowed to light and where to put it. She let the beam travel up the wall. The ceiling was lower here, vein-streaked with mineral and salt. A fissure zigzagged above her like a child's lightning, feathered at its edges with white crystal and, at one run, lined with a fresh stain that ran wider than the rest. Fan-shaped, carried, as if a hand had spilled and the stone had licked it and sent it on. She raised her palm, patient, and felt a small, colder draft against the glove where water moved without looking like it moved. She rolled her wrist. The divers had already set about their work. One pegging a scale next to the crate corner for the camera, the other holding a finger to two long bones laid against the wall by the tide as carefully as by a curator. Femur, tibia, human proportions, human weight. The cortical surfaces were pale under algae film. At the distal end of the tibia, a shallow, parallel striation showed as a bright score against the dull. Knife, not rock. Another on the radius lying half buried in the sand. The cut still crisp, edges unrounded, the color too clean to be old. Shaw photographed what the light gave. The striations at a rake, her ruler's centimeters by each mark, the cheap coin of proof. She could feel the cave changing underneath the work, a pressure that isn't a touch so much as an arithmetic. Her suit clung a fraction closer. Her exhalations started to slow because the part of the brain that counts tides had woken up and was doing sums. The third diver tapped her shoulder and pointed toward the back wall. There, in the join where rock met rock, something glinted and refused to stop being a circle. Brass, curving out of a fissure as if it had been placed there and the stone had grown around it like coral. Not a coin too thick, not a porthole too small, a bowl or housing for a needle that wasn't there. She took a single photograph and then another, fighting her own want. Not today, not yet. She turned her torch back to the ceiling. The fissure led straight up. If she drew the line through rock, it would surface under the lantern room. The salt tatting looked new where it fringed the last flow, the way hoarfrost looks new even if it learned how last night. Along one flank of the seam, a run of iron stain had feathered into the crystal so recently it hadn't found its shape. Pressure from below. Capillary action. A body's old talent learned by stone. The cave breathed. Shaw felt it in her mask strap and in the soft tug at the hair she'd pinned flat under the hood. The divers felt it too. She saw both heads lift. The strobe at the entrance pulsed, and for half a second the cave seemed to pulse with it. Light, dark, light, thin heartbeat. The water, which had been clear enough for 3 meters of fidelity, began to lose its color in the way a face loses blood. Not silt, not yet. A deepening. Black works differently underwater. It eats detail first and then depth, and then you find yourself inside a room you cannot measure. Shaw's chest went tight on an old, unhelpful memory. Brown water under a canal bridge, summer, a boy's shout cut short, and she reined it back to the present like a horse before a ditch. She tapped the leader's shoulder and made the flat-palmed out signal. He returned it, clipped calm. The second diver swung his camera one last time across the bones and caught the knife scores square on, then tucked the rig in against his body and moved. They used their lines the way miners do, hands counting the truth, never trusting the eyes. The pull at Shaw's calves strengthened in a way that wasn't panicked yet but had that option. She frog-kicked, careful not to scull sand from the floor, and let the cave's throat draw them toward the slot. At the lip, the water's color had gone treacle dark. Outside, the world was the sort of black that isn't simply the absence of light but the presence of something with appetite. She felt, fleetingly, the smallest different temperature thread against her neck where the suit seal meets skin. A ribbon of warm in a sea that had decided to be cold, like breath in a church doorway. The same warmth she'd felt on her glove when she'd capped the drop last night. They went through the slot single file, the crack printing the tanks with a squeak like teeth on glass. Outside, the sea was taking its decision. Shaw felt the push of the first indifferent muscles of tide beginning its turn. Behind, the cave exhaled once, a long bass note the rock made when the pressure difference found a narrow. Her torch threw a lemony fan that became wedge-thin in the dark. At the surface, the wind had freshened and the sky had dropped a tone. Harry hauled the first diver in by his harness, then the second. Shaw reached for the ribs tube and let Harry's forearm be a lever. The air up here was no kinder. It simply had fewer rules. She pulled her mask to her forehead and spit out the reg. It felt like leaving one language and remembering another too quickly. Knife marks, the photographer said, already lifting the housing to keep it from knocking. Several. Some new, no rounding. The bones still, God forgive me, clean. Crate corners, plural, the leader added, dragging the fin strap over his heel. At least 2. One with stenciling C number, possibly a V. Shackles in a heap shoremade. Ceiling fissure under your lamp. And, he looked at Shaw. Brass. We left it. But it's there. Jammed in the rock like it meant to wait. Shaw sat down hard on the tube and let her heartbeat catch up with her. Beyond the bow, the water darkened by degrees that wouldn't show on a clock. We go back with proper permits, she said. Coroner on deck, scene of crime underwater. Today we take what the camera gave and we tell the truth we can swear to. Harry blew air out of his cheeks and didn't say the thing his face was thinking. Black tide's coming on again tomorrow, he said instead. You'd best not be in that throat when it truly turns. Back on the quay, Shaw stripped out of neoprene and found her land legs like a woman who'd changed trains. The gulls were silent the way coastal birds are when they aren't sure which side of a storm they prefer. She walked the cliff path with no courage to spare on poetry and knocked on the cottage door hard enough to make the latch complain. Grigg opened like a man opening his own chest. He looked at the damp on her hair and at the ozone still on her skin. Well, he said, it wasn't a question. We found your cave, Shaw said. Crates, chains, human remains with blade marks, a fissure to your foundation, and something brass lodged where the rock pretends not to have room. Grigg shut his eyes the way you shut them for the doctor. I told you I don't go down there. You're coming with me now, she said. No heat in it, only gravity. We're going to talk about what's in your family's keeping and who taught you to keep it. Shaw confronts Grigg. Part 15, Keeper's Confession. Grigg didn't make her wait in the doorway. He stepped back, and the cottage swallowed them both. The kettle on the hob had boiled itself to silence and forgotten why. Shaw shut the door with a careful hand and slid the bolt, not to trap him but to keep the weather out of what she was asking. He stood by the small table where the logbook had sat, where 2 pages had not, and wiped his palms on his trousers as if the truth were a substance he could remove before it stained. The lighthouse through the window was a white slice. The glass made it kinder than it was. Tell me, Shaw said. He didn't ask what. He took the chair with his back to the wall and set his hands on the table as if to show they were empty. It isn't a secret you can point at, he said, voice rough from salt and not sleeping. It's a weight. It's what men in my family were told to carry, and what they carried even when they wanted to set it down. Shaw let that sit. Start where it starts for you. My father gave me the key to the gallery and the other key, he said, and now his eyes flicked to the floor, toward the hatch under the stair he still would not name. He said our work was twofold. Keep the light for ships. Keep the thing that wants the sea for itself where it can't point where it shouldn't. The relic, Shaw said. He shut his eyes once, open and shut, a man stepping into cold water and deciding not to gasp. A brass compass, he said, older than the iron on the quay, the kind that sits in a gimbaled bowl and knows how to keep its needle steady when the world forgets what steady is. Came up in '89, they tell it. My grandfather hid it after men died for it, and my father hid it again when the Finch brought trouble. I kept it where he told me. We don't sell it, we don't show it, we don't let it out. That's the rule. Why keep it at all? He looked past her, toward the tower, and for a second she saw a boy under a man's skin. Because it feeds when the tide is right, he said, so simply she almost missed how wrong the sentence was. And if it feeds, the weather breaks the other way. Fewer names on boards. Fewer wives staring at doors. You give the sea what it thinks it's owed, and it leaves the rest of us be. Shaw felt the ledger step into the room behind him. When the light bleeds, the sea is owed. It feeds what? The sea, he said. Call it that if you like. Call it the dark. Call it the pull under everything. I don't argue with a word when the thing itself has the stronger back. His tongue worked against the inside of his cheek. He found the place the next words lived and brought them to her like a man carrying glass. On black tide nights, it calls. You can feel it in the stone, feel it under your feet. You keep it where it is. You don't let it out into hands that don't understand it. You make sure it gets the dew it takes, not more. That's our job. The other keepers called it superstition to outsiders. In here, it's maintenance. Maintenance, Shaw repeated. She didn't let irony touch it. He scrubbed his face with both hands and left his skin reddened where the beard had one. Your man from London came with questions he'd practiced saying. He wasn't here for boats or weather. He was here for the compass. He had a paper voice, loan items, private collection, rightful restoration. He thought words could make what it is smaller. Grig's mouth twisted. He watched from the clifftop the night before last. Then he came to the cottage and knocked like a man asking to borrow sugar. I told him to go. He had a diver's torch in his pocket. He looked at my hands when I said no, like I was a lock he could learn. What did he do? Waited for the turn, Grig said. He went down the old quarry cut with rope and a courage he hadn't paid enough for. He worked his way into the throat you found today, and he put his hand where the brass shows. The cave has a way of making men think they can bargain. He pulled when it wanted him to leave it be. And then, Grig's eyes were no longer on her. They were on something only he could see. The light ran red, because it always runs a little when hands have been where they shouldn't. The seams sweat. The tower learns the names it has to say. It was starting before he went in. When he tugged, he opened his hand and let it fall. The water went wrong in the throat. The pull came strong when it should have been slack. He lost his rope and grabbed at the housing, and the needle bit him. I heard him shout. It wasn't long. You were down there? Shaw said softly. No, he said. I was above in the stair, because you can feel it through your bones when the throat breathes wrong. I went to the hatch and listened. The sound changes when a man dies in water. There's a quiet that doesn't sit right with anything born on land. He swallowed and it sounded like it hurt. I found him after. The cave coughed him up like a man chokes on a bone. Shaw kept her voice the kind that belongs to notes rather than to men's insides. You moved the body. I took him out of the throat and down to the ledge, Grig said. I left him where the tide would find him clean and honest, and no mother would have to hear there was no shore. I didn't kill him. He looked at her then, direct, the blue of his eyes gone salt-pale with fatigue. I didn't have to. The place does its own arithmetic. Why not call us? Because if I put that place on paper, you would come with boats and cables and men with drills. You would crack it open like it was a lock on a shed. The last time men tried to make it theirs, we buried more than we counted. His jaw set. You can hate that. It doesn't change the tide table. Shaw thought of bones clean under green, knife striations that hadn't learned to be old yet, a crate corner with a ghosted V, a brass curve patient as a coin in a church floor. How many times has it fed on your watch? He flinched. It takes what the sea would have taken anyway, he said, speaking not to her but to the ledger on the table that wasn't there. A man who steps where the path falls away. A stranger who stands too close because he thinks weather is a story. A thief with a brave idea. I keep it from asking neighbors' names. That's what I tell myself when I sleep. Your father, Shaw said. Robert. Did he call it payment? Grig shut his eyes until tears didn't fall and then opened them again, furious at his own face for having its reflex. He called it keeping. He called it the cost of calm. He never said sacrifice. The men in kitchens said that so they didn't have to say anything true. What did he do the night the Finch went down? Grig's hands tightened on the table until the tendons showed like wire. He went to the hatch and he listened. He did what I did. He brought what he found to where the sea could have it back. After, he put his key down and left because there are things a man can keep and still live, and there are things a man can keep and not. He had kept it too long. Silence took a chair. The cottage clock ticked at a rhythm the sea would not have respected. Shaw let it count 5, then said, Where is the compass? Exactly? Grig sat very straight and then he shook his head once. No. You understand, Thomas, that right now you're telling me a man died in proximity to an object you are concealing. You understand what that looks like. I understand men look at a thing they want gone and call it evidence, he said, not unkindly. I won't tell you where in the cave it rests. If I do, the next thing I'll hear is chain on a boat and a drill against stone. And then every storm for a decade will write a petition in the harbor, and you will come read names you've never met and fold your hands and say unfortunate. You think you're protecting them. He stared through her. I know I am. Don't ask me to prove it to a clerk. Roker tried to take it, she said, bringing him back to the smaller circle. That's your claim. He had the diver's torch and the wrong kind of courage, Griggs said. He had papers that said restoration and a voice that said possession. Shaw moved her pencil across the notebook slowly. Did you touch him? Griggs' mouth thinned. I put my hands on a dead man long enough to carry him where the tide could have the last word. That's all. He inhaled. I wiped the rail when I was done. I didn't touch your lens. I didn't make your 7 minutes red. That belongs to whatever it belongs to. I don't rule it. Where are the missing pages from your maintenance log? He almost smiled at that thin, tired. In the stove, he said. Or in the bin. Doesn't matter now, you've seen what you've seen. Shaw marked the lie of it with a small dot and let it pass. There were pages enough elsewhere. I'm going to recover the compass, she said, and he made a small noise in his throat like a man who has swallowed the wrong way. Not to sell, not to parade, to remove it from a calculus that keeps making bodies and stories I can't take to court. You'll make it worse, he said. Maybe, she said, maybe I'll make it different, and different is the only direction out of a corridor like this. He looked at her with an expression that belonged to one of the men in the old photographs. Flat, refused panic, the kind of courage that doesn't make speeches. You'll go on a black tide night, he said. You'll go because you think the tide owes you an answer. I'll go because the place owes me a body count I can stop, she said. And because you won't show me, I'll go when your house is listening the loudest. He put his hands in his lap as if to keep them from finding work. If you try to take it, he said, it will make its own arrangements. Everything does, Shaw said. Wind walked a palm across the cottage window. The lighthouse looked back at them both and didn't have to say anything. Shaw closed her notebook and stood. We'll post an officer at the path, she said. We'll keep your door clear of men who want to make their own folklore. If you think of anything you've forgotten to tell me, call. If you decide not to, call anyway. He nodded once. The muscles along his jaw had become stone. She reached the door and paused. Thomas, she said without turning. When did you last put your hand on it? The pause lasted long enough for her to think he would keep it. Then, last winter, he said, when the storm came late. It burned like a coin from a hearth. She left him with the kettle that didn't know it had cooled. Outside, the air tasted of iron the way the tongue of a battery does. She stood in the lee and let the plan harden until it had edges. She would not ask for permission. She would not announce a seizure. She would not brief the harbor with a map that could leave the room by accident. She would take one diver she trusted to keep his mouth and his head. She would be in the water at the black tide with a bag stiff enough for brass and a line that sang. She would go in quiet and come out quieter. Then she would see what the sea did when it was no longer being fed what someone thought it wanted. Shaw plans covert retrieval. Part 16, Descent for the Relic. The black tide came on like an eclipse practiced at restraint. By the time Shaw zipped her suit on the lee side of the rocks, the horizon had already folded itself into the same dark as the sea. No crew, no Coast Guard lights, no Harry with a clipboard pretending not to believe. She'd left a note with a time in the duty book that meant if I'm not back, pull me out of the throat even if the sea objects. It would read like procedure and smell like prayer. She clipped a line from her harness to the bolt she'd sunk that afternoon above the slot, the tender that wasn't a tender, and checked the knot by touch, then checked it again. Her other hand settled the bag she'd chosen for brass. Ripstop mouth, rigid ribs. She palmed her torch, took one breath against the redge to make sure the thing remembered its work, and backed into the dark. The water greeted her warmer than it ought to have been. A skin temperature slip that felt wrong on principle. She finned slow along the face, angle of descent memorized. The rock shoulder on her left a presence more than a seen object. The strobe she'd left earlier winked from the slot, the only polite thing in the world. She reached it, laid her palm on the carabiner as if it were someone's shoulder, then slid inside. The throat took her as it had before, stone close enough to talk to her tank. Her exhalations ran up the slate and came back as small riddles. In the chamber, her torch built a world where there wasn't one. Sand. Shell. The half-buried rectangle of the crate corner with its shy V in the stencil. The shackles in their ugly sleep. Bones where she had left them to the coroner's paperwork. All present. And at the back, in the join where rock met rock, the concave gleam of brass. It was exactly as the divers had described it and worse. A housing set into a fissure as if stone had grown around it. The rim crusted with mineral like a chalice left in a cave and worshipped by salt. Inside the bowl, something dark where a needle should have been. No needle at all, she realized, not broken but missing, or else swallowed by a fluid so black it made water look honest. She came in close and the world narrowed to the few inches around the metal. The rim was wedged under a lip of stone. The fissure pinched just enough to hold fast through gales and greed. She slid her fingers around the opposite side, tested the give. None. She felt along the circumference until her glove found the place where pressure had done what it always does. Made a weakness in a system that pretends to be whole. She breathed once, slow, equalized the urge to rush out of her head, and set her grip. The bag's mouth stood ready beside her, a square waiting to be told what it should hold. She pulled. At first nothing but a complaint, a tiny, unanchored sound a machine makes when you lift it wrong. Then the motion, microscopic and absolute, of something deciding that this will not be the moment it stays. The rim moved a hair. She adjusted the angle, felt the lip of stone graze the glove, and pulled again with the steadiness of a person who knows panic is a third hand you can't afford. The brass came free on a gulp. The cave answered. The fissure above her cleared its throat and issued a thread that thickened in a heartbeat. A warm jet like arterial heat finding water and bullying it aside. It struck her wrist through the glove, hot, indecent, and the iron smell hit even with a regulator between her teeth. Her torch caught the flow and made it a lens of red. The beam reddened the cave and turned her hands the color of a story. The bag mouthed the compass as she told it to. She folded the ribs, dragged the draw tight with her teeth, and clamped the clip to her D-ring. The fluid jetted harder, pressure stitching a seam of warmth along her forearm. It moved with intent, not as water moves, but as something pushed by lungs. The cave began to use its own throat. Her torch swung across the chamber as she turned, and what she saw refused to choose between the natural and the other thing. Indistinct shapes moved in the dark, pale, ribboning, not fish, not holy fabric, not holy knot. They flittered like strips of kelp, and then swam like eels, and then lay still like rope. One slid past her mask, and for an unhelpful pulse she thought hand. It wasn't, but it had the exact wrong idea of one. Another curled over the shackles, as if remembering the work those jaws had done. The camera's memory from earlier superimposed. Bones, scored. Her mind began to read more than light gave. She shook her head once in the small, ludicrous gesture people make underwater when they mean to dislodge a thought, and the motion shivered the beam across the floor. Sand lifted. The chamber's water, already warmer than it promised at the surface, grew murkier, viscous as broth. She felt the first petulant tug at her calves. Tide turning, or the cave beginning to seal itself against her as a body closes a wound. Her line hummed. The good sound, the string to the surface telling her I am here. She put her hand on it, planted her fins, and gave herself the measured 3 kicks toward the slot. The bag dragged wrong for a second, the brass inside catching on some invisible edge, and she rolled her hip to free it, the way you do with a child's arm caught in a sleeve. The shapes moved again, in and out of the torch, siding toward her and away, curious or hungry or neither. The warmth at her wrist had cooled to the temperature of fear. At the slot, the squeeze that had felt like an intimacy earlier now had the manners of a crowd. She angled the bag ahead so it wouldn't snag, shouldered her tank through, and felt stone-kiss rubber in the small, rude scrape of a thing that measures. The line sang under her hand, higher now, the note a little strained as the tide took the slack it had previously been willing to leave. Outside, the black tide had decided what kind of dark it wanted to be. Her torch made a tight lemon wedge that got eaten as it flew. She let the line have its say and followed the turn she'd memorized. The one that carries you past the tooth of rock that wants your strap. The the one that gives you 1 meter more than you deserve if you're patient. Behind her, the cave exhaled again. The sound traveled through stone and into her mask strap, bass enough to be felt in teeth. The warmth thinned, then stopped, and the water at her neck went abruptly cold, as if the cave had shut a valve and reseated itself for the night. The strobe showed her the last 2 meters like a friend waving from a door. She touched the carabiner in passing for luck she didn't believe in and climbed out of the slot into black water that had become the only thing in the world. The word was a rope in a throat. She climbed it. Air had never been as ordinary as when she broke it with her head. The wind was a handful of glass. She kicked the last yards to the ledge in short, angry strokes and let her hands find weed stone, then the bolt head she'd set. Her breath lifted and lifted again. The bag knocked her hip solid. She laid it on the rock and laid herself beside it and laughed once into the night in the small, disbelieving way you do when you have no other choice. She stripped the mask and the reg with fingers that had turned from tools into friends. The lighthouse stood very near and very far. For 7 minutes it hadn't colored the world this time. The red had happened below, and she had brought something out of it that shouldn't want air. She didn't open the bag. She wanted to. Every part of her wanted to. She didn't. She clipped it to the haul line she'd set and hand overhanded along the weed-slick rock until she could shoulder it like a sleeping dog. The path up seemed to know when she'd stolen something. It tried to take it from her twice and failed. By the time she reached the low wall where she'd left the towel and the flask, her legs had begun to feel like the wrong size. She sat on the wall with the bag between her knees and her head down, listening to her organs remember land. The sea below made a noise like a crowd telling a story all at once in a language she didn't speak. She wiped her face with the towel and realized she'd smeared it with something darker than weed. The iron smell made it into her mouth to tell her its one fact again. Her phone was a cold rectangle in her pocket. She didn't call anyone. Not yet. She had not decided what tense the next sentence would use. When she slid the compass out at last, carefully, wrapped in the towel she didn't care about, it was heavier than its size said it had a right to be. The brass was dull and clean at once, the way coins are after someone has kept them in a palm too long. The bowl's rim was engraved with a thin ropework. The gimbal collar had a notch where a needle should have pivoted and didn't. On the underside, where time couldn't reach, someone had scratched a mark with something sharp. A spiral that turned one way, then the other, meeting itself like two hands that have decided not to shake. She cradled it the way you cradle hot porcelain you aren't ready to set down. The metal soaked into her gloves, through the neoprene, through her skin. It wasn't warm the way bodies are. It was warm the way hearth coins are, or stones left on a sill in thin sun. Only there had been no sun where this had been, and the warmth didn't leave when the wind touched it. She wrapped it again and pushed it back into the bag. The world steadied a fraction, then tilted in the other direction and steadied there. She stood, shouldered the weight, and started the path toward the car as if carrying a thing to a different room could ever be more than a way to make a decision slower. Back on land, compass feels unnaturally warm. Part 17, the compass is past. By morning the brass had cooled to the kind of warmth that feels like memory. Shaw locked it in an evidence locker at the station. Signed, sealed, photographed from 4 angles, and then drove to the county record office with the key a hard rectangle against her thigh. Paper before sea. Always. Naval archives live like cathedrals. Orderly, quiet, convinced of their own patience. She requested Admiralty, losses, late 18th C. And a clerk with careful fingers rolled out a bound folio whose leather had learned obedience. She traced the index down to Valiant, HMS, 1798, Survey, Western Approaches, all hands. The entry was short and exacting. HMS Valiant, 10-gun survey sloop. Master, Lieutenant A. Keene. Last sighting, June 17, 1798. Weather, squally, low visibility. Reported lost with all hands. Presumed foundered on uncharted hazard. Stores, standard survey equipment. No ordnance beyond issue. Notable, Admiralty Compass Mk. 3, survey, numbered and logged. The last line had been underlined by some officious ghost more than a century ago, and then underlined again by a later hand that hadn't trusted the first underline to do its work. Shaw copied the relevant lines and asked for Admiralty, Stores and Salvage, 19th C. The clerk produced a register of sales and a sheaf of correspondence that smelt like damp ambition. In the letters there was a gap where she had hoped for a clean chain. No Admiralty disposal of Valiant's instruments, no sale to a museum, no donation to a gentleman of learning. Not recovered, the column said, on a page that carried 3 other ships under the same year. The compass remained the property of the missing and the sea. She turned the page and time jumped like a record with a scratch. 1889. The year Penderow's ledger began. A spidery letter from a private salvage concern in Newland to a broker in London mentioned, obliquely, furtively, a brass survey compass of naval pattern, believed to be of Valiant extraction. The broker's hand came back the next week. Decline for now. Cost of heat too high. The letter had a greasy thumbprint in the margin, the sort of stain that puts its own date on paper. Shaw bagged a copy. Illicit salvage lived in correspondences like this, euphemism for product, brevity for intent. She rang Julian Armitage from the stairwell, where pipework carried the building's old breath and turned it into a hum. HMS Valiant, she said without decoration. He made a pleased, unhappy noise. I thought as much. 1798. She was plotting shoals and chases when the weather decided to make a lesson of her. Your compass would have been numbered once. There's mark work on the underside, she said. A ropework engraving and a scratched spiral hand-cut, not factory. No broad arrow. Broad arrows were proud, he said. Smugglers aren't. They file what they can't stop seeing and scratch what they want to start believing. 1889, you said? That's the year you notice everything in your ledger starts using the word bleed as if it belongs to the lighthouse. Because the compass came ashore, Shaw said, tracing with her thumb the pencil rub she'd made of the V on the Finch's manifest. And because men wanted it to pay its keep. You'll find a run of small drownings that year attached to names that don't get carved in the churchyard because it's cheaper not to, Armitage said. Salvagers used up by a calm sea and a bad idea. A run of bad luck so convincing that men stopped calling it luck. The superstition, the one Agnes gave you the polite version of, took that shape about then. The compass marks a keeper. The keeper marks the debt. Marks, picks, attaches. Like metal takes hand heat and doesn't forget it. The story goes that once you take the thing from the sea against her will, she writes down who's responsible. You can pass the duty along, like a corroded coin in a family Bible, but you can't throw it into someone else's orchard. If you take the compass inland, say, the coast throws fits. Nets empty for a season. So they say. Shaw let the stairwell's hum fill the beat between them. And the Griggs. Elias first, Armitage said. The board minute you found in 1901 is the official language for an unofficial arrangement. Observe and record means keep your mouth until your teeth ache. Elias holds the key. The tower starts its red habit. Then Robert inherits a place and a job and a glass he has to polish without looking at it. He presides over a black tide that swallows a ship called Sable Finch carrying something that pretends to be instruments and is not. He resigns because guilt is heavier than brass. Thomas keeps every rule he's been given until you arrive with a different set. And the belief in the lane, Shaw said, hearing Agnes's father on the mole. The sea is owed. That the compass marks a keeper. That it wants blood when the moon has left the sky. Ritual is how men pad the distance between cause and effect, Armitage said. But yes, the working story is, the compass must not leave Cornwall. The family that keeps the light keeps the hunger from naming neighbors too often. If you want the older, nastier version, you buy a very local man a very local drink and chew it like gristle. I suspect you've nearly done both. Shaw looked through the window at a rectangle of sky the color of old aluminium. Is there record of the compass ever traveling? Twice, Armitage said. Once briefly, late 1889, onto a cart bound upriver. The cart broke an axle on the bridge. The man driving drowned in 4 feet of water, sober. The story put itself away after that. The other attempt was a collector in 1921. He put the compass in a satchel and made it as far as the next parish before his boat stalled under a clear sky. He sold his right to stones after. The parish stonemason needed not to write a name. Genealogy, she said. Smugglers into shipping agents into chairs of respectable committees. And keepers into keepers, he said. Inheritance is a machine a county builds to save itself the intellectual labor of starting over. Shaw closed her notebook. Thank you, detective, he said, the tobacco back in his voice. If you plan to move it, expect the weather to read the indictment first. Back at the station, she signed out the evidence locker and set the bag on the table like a child napping where adults are trying to talk. She opened it as if the air might want a share of what was inside. The brass lay dull as late gold. The ropework on the rim a neat lie that made it look harmless. Up close, she could see faint nicks around the gimbal collar where some impatient hand had tried once to lever it free of a casing. The underside scratched spiral sat where a maker's mark should be, two arms meeting, then turning back into each other. She wondered which Grigg had drawn it. She wondered what they had thought it would do. She photographed it again. She wrote down the numbers stamped where the light could reach. Tiny, careful strikes you had to court to see. 3 and 7 9. The kind of numbers that know they matter only to the people who will drown if they're wrong. The compass didn't point. It was a bowl without a needle. Yet holding it felt like standing too close to a dog that's thinking about disliking you. Energy without direction. She set it down on the towel and it made a sound like a soft coin on wood. Her palms tingled where the heat had finally changed their minds. Records gave her the rest. Parish notes, penciled on the back of a program, mentioned 3 salvagers from the Newland venture dead by sickness or accident within the year. The harbor register carried a terse entry, not quite incidental. Bleed witness marks reported, weather unseasonably clement thereafter. In the ledger Penrose's grandfather had written under 1889, a sentence with no flourish at all. They pulled up a thing that shouldn't have been moved, and from then the tower learned to say what the sea asks. There were no dates beside Grigg baptisms and funerals that did not frame a black tide in one direction or another. She sat a long time with those notations stacked like deck chairs. The case had a spine now. 1798 loss, 1889 theft dressed as salvage, a long century's barter system of fear and weather, men binding duty to blood until it looked like religion. The thing on her table was not mystical. It was metal. But men had used it to build a story, and the story had returned the favor and shaped them back. She moved to the window and let the day be seen. Down the street, a boy dragged a stick along fence rails, counting. The lighthouse, far out, was a pale scratch on the horizon. The word evidence sat wrong against the word curse. The law could do a lot with the first and nothing with the second. But the line between them was where people lived. She could log the compass, call county, call a museum that would send a registrar with a padded crate and a soothing voice about conservation. She could issue a press line. Significant artifact recovered in connection with historical investigation. A dozen respectable men would applaud. A dozen quiet ones would watch the weather with their mouths pinned shut. Or she could treat it like a live cable. Cut it from the circuit it had been killing on and hope the lights stopped doing tricks. She turned back to the table. The brass sat there without choosing sides. The ropework engraving caught the office light and threw it back at a timbre lower than it had received. She reached out and pressed 2 fingers to the rim. It was not warm now, not in any ordinary way. It was simply itself, dense in a world stubborn about being solved by lists. Crace's voice came back to her from the cafe. Paper hurts men who hide behind old stone. And Armitage's, if you strip the story and leave the function bare, the people who were grateful for the story get angry. And Agnes. Some tides are debts we name so we can wake up tomorrow. Shaw pictured the cave mouth, the fissure, the 7 minutes of red. She pictured Roker tipping forward in water that had begun to feel like blood. She pictured Thomas Grigg as a boy being handed 2 keys and a rule someone had decided was good enough to inherit. She wrapped the compass again and slid it back into the bag. She locked the locker and stood with the key in her palm until the little rectangle's corners left temporary dents in her skin. Shaw debates turning it in. Part 18, Final Black Tide. The black tide announced itself by stealing the color out of town. Window glass turned to slate. The harbor bell, which rang politely in daytime winds, fell dumb. Shaw was halfway down the station steps when her phone lit with 2 words from the constable posted at the point. It started. She didn't ask what it was. The sound reached her before she reached the car. Not waves, breath. The sea drawing in one long draft and holding it. She drove without the radio, without a thought spare for traffic. On the last bend, the lighthouse came clean out of the fog like a tooth. The lens had gone red again. Not the theater of last night. No measured glow, no 7-minute courtesy. This was a wound and a warning. Lines had already begun their work down the tower's white, tight rivulets, then broader, then a sheet finding its own narrowness as it learned the stone. The smell hit the cliff path and turned mouths metallic. The constable at the rope was white around the edges. "Keeper's not inside," he said, more to convince himself than her. "I checked the cottage. Door wide. He's on the shore." "Stay here," she said. He stayed because he couldn't think of a world where that wasn't the order. Griggs stood halfway down the rocks, coat open, hair blown flat in one direction and then the other as if the weather were undecided which way to scold him. The red on the tower caught his face and made him look like he'd been standing too near a fire. When he saw her, he cupped his hands and shouted against the wind's throat, voice ragged and certain. "It's calling it back." "Back from where?" she shouted, though she already knew the answer. "From the locker, from the bag, from the neat, lockable place where paper understands custody and tide does not." She ran. The station was 7 minutes behind her and an hour away. She covered it in 4. The key stuck a heartbeat in the locker hasp and then yielded. The bag was where she'd left it and nothing else was right. The brass inside had found heat again. Not warmth. Heat with opinions. She lifted it with both hands and the metal spoke through the towel like a live wire held at both ends. Back at the cliff, the world had tightened to a funnel. The wind came down the gully and pushed. The sea came up the gully and pulled. The lighthouse bled so hard the stone looked polished. The gallery panes were red glass. No figure in the windows. No movement at the door. The tower did not need a man to do this. Griggs saw the bag and knew what choice she had already made. "Don't," he said uselessly, then, helplessly honest. "If you're going to, go now." She had not brought a suit. There wasn't time to argue with neoprene or buckles. She stripped to boots and shirt and wrapped the towel once around her middle, the sort of stupid courtesy people pay when they're about to do something they'd rather not be witnessed doing. She slung the bag across her body and tied it off high. The rock was grease under weed. The spray lifted in curtains and slapped back. At the ledge, the sea reached for her with both hands. Cold climbed her to the ribs in one step and to the throat in the next. She waited for the shock to take her, and it didn't. The heat from the bag ate a hole in the cold big enough to stand in. She used it. The slot was a darker dark in a wall of dark. She aimed for the wink of the strobe she hadn't had time to place and found, in its absence, the shape of the throat by touch. The seam where smooth stone became bitten stone, the bevel that steals your shoulder if you turn wrong. The bag tried to float. She shoved it down and the brass answered gravity like a prayer. A cross current shouldered her and then thought better of it. The cave breathed out. She slid in on the borrowed breath. Inside was red without light. Her eyes made a film out of the smell. The fissure in the ceiling had become a mouth. Warmth jetted from it in a thin, obscene stream. The shackles on the floor lay like quiet gossip. The bones she had photographed yesterday kept their polite angle against the wall and took no position. Something moved at the edge of her vision. Ribbon, eel, rope, hand, and decided not to be named. She didn't dither. She took the compass out of the bag and it made the water around her feel like soup next to a brazier. The brass sat in her hands as if it had weight and will separate from mass. She waded into the back corner where the rock had grown around the bowl and put it back where the world had decided it belonged. You don't slot a thing like that, you seat it. She did. The fit was indecently perfect. The cave made a noise like relief. The jet from the fissure narrowed, then stopped clean, as if someone had shut a tap. The heat leached from the water around her like breath from a room after a door closes. Outside, the ocean's inhalation broke and became a cough, then the ordinarier heave. The red at the edge of her vision drained to the kind of brown that forgets its own name. She held the rim a beat too long, the way you hold a hand you're not supposed to hold, then let go. The brass did not so much settle as agree. She turned, mouth open for breath she didn't need, and found the slot by the old knowledge in her bones. The water was colder by inches now. The shapes, whatever they were, had lost interest or appetite. They lay back like discarded ribbon. Her boots slid on a slick and found purchase. At the lip the sea took her head and banged it against rock with the impersonal precision of a correction. She came up laughing once and coughing twice, then wiped blood and salt out of one eye with the heel of her hand and pushed for the ledge. Grigg had gone waist-deep to get an arm under her. "Stupid," he said. It was gratitude with all the vowels knocked out of it. Together they got her high enough to let the next wave miss where it would have liked to strike. On the path, the constable said her name twice in the tone men use when they are asking if a thing in front of them is alive. She was. They stood and watched the tower do nothing at all. The red had stopped as if a switch had been thrown. The last thin runs ticked themselves away in drops on rock, the sound small and brief against the old, big sound of water. The gallery panes went back to showing fog and the suggestion of lamp guts. No stain issued from the seams. The white of the masonry looked like honest paint again, and a man who wanted to would call the brown at the base rust. And if he said it hard enough, men in a bar would nod so they didn't have to be the one to disagree. Shaw discovered then that she was shaking. Not from cold, her skin registered cold the way photographs register touch, but from the thing that happens when a decision leaves the body. She sat down on the shingle like a woman who had just remembered she had knees. Grigg sat beside her, as far away as a confession and as close as family. "You see it," he said, "not a question." "I see what happens when the object goes where a story says it should," she said. Her voice sounded like someone else's used it first. "And I see what happens when it doesn't. It's this place," he said almost gently. "Whatever it is, it's not in me. It's in the rock. We just live close." Shaw thought of Agnes's father on the mole. The sea is owed. Of Armitage. Strip the story and the people grateful for the story get angry. Of Crace. Paper hurts men who hide behind old stone. She thought of blood-card profiles singing at 30 meters under her microscope woman's hands. She thought of the smell in the cave and the taste on the air. "It's the place," she said, "and the habit men built around it to make themselves necessary." From the ledge, the constable lifted a hand. "Inspector." He pointed down to the rocks where the red had been busiest. Something lay there like a scrap of sail that had decided to be a rectangle. The sea, already reverting to its usual lack of interest in drama, pushed at it once and, failing to get purchase, left it where it was. Shaw didn't stand yet. She watched the tower's white and waited for it to betray itself again. "Didn't. You'll still try to take it," Grigg said after a time, the teacher guessing the answer and asking anyway. "I tried," she said. "I did take it. And then you gave it back." She looked at him without turning her head. "I returned evidence to a scene to prevent further contamination," she said, and the sentence sat between them like a compromise neither had asked for. "Tomorrow I'll write something a clerk can store. Tonight I did the thing that stopped it." He rubbed his hands together hard, as if the salt on his skin could be warmed off by friction alone. "The sea doesn't write receipts." "No," she said, "but it leaves trails." She nodded toward the ledge. "Sometimes it even leaves notes." He followed her gaze, then huffed a laugh once, short. The fog thinned and let the lamp tower show one clean edge against the sky. The gulls, who had learned early that spectacle doesn't feed you, came back, screaming at nothing they could change. Her phone vibrated under wet cloth. The lab, no doubt, or the sergeant, or Crace with a gambler's curiosity. She didn't look. The decision sat in her the way a wet stone sits in a pocket, heavy and honest. She had broken the circuit and reconnected it. What that made her was a problem for tomorrow's Shaw. Tonight, the calculus of blood and brass and stone had acknowledged a transaction and shut its books. They climbed the path in a silence the wind allowed. At the rope, the constable tried to offer a blanket and made do with his own jacket when she refused it. When Shaw reached the car, she remembered to breathe like a person again and felt wretchedly, gloriously mortal. She drove home without the heater. The cold made its argument and then backed down when it understood she wasn't listening. The lighthouse shrank in the mirror and did not change color. On her table in the flat, she set out her notebook, the 4 photographs of the compass, the rub of Vail, from the Finch's manifest, the copy of the Admiralty entry with not recovered underlined by ghosts. She put the pen beside them and left it uncapped. The wet clothes steamed a little on the back of a chair, making the room smell like a harbor after closing time. Only then did she allow herself to be curious about the thing on the rocks. But when the tide went out, it had left something on the ledge, flat and pale against the stone. Part 19, The Sea's Return. Dawn came up the color of old tin. Shaw parked at the rope and walked down alone, the constable's blanket offer folded into a sheepish nod. The tower had the decency to look ordinary. Sea-birds worked the wind with the bored industry of creatures who had seen spectacle and found it did not improve breakfast. Where the red had fallen hardest, the rock wore a brown geometry. Fan marks, rills dried into stipple. Between 2 runs, something lay that hadn't been there the night before. Not weed, not rag. Paper. She crouched. It had the sick heft of a page that has learned to be waterlogged and failed to be anything but page anyway. One corner was torn on the diagonal. The fibers at the edge had pulled like hair. She knew that tear. She had seen the absence it made in a spiral-bound spine on a desk that smelt of brine and false names. She slid a palette knife under the sheet and lifted. The ink had bled in places and in others sat dark, as if the pen had been pushing through reluctance. Across the middle, written with the stubbornness of block capitals that had found their nerve in a moving hand. Not done. The letters had a shape she recognized from the impression rub in Lorna Tresitter's room. The stingy crossbar on the T, the way the O liked to think it was an ellipse, the diagonal in the N cut a fraction long so it overshot the baseline. Roker's capitals. Not a copy. Not a guess. Him. The page's ruled lines ghosted the same spacing as the notebook she had bagged. The paper stock matched. Cheap, over-bleached, willing to take pencil hard. She turned it and saw, faint as the shadow of a ship under cloud, the top of a list, Calder, the tail of the Argonne. Turn ATL, then water taking it. Page 50-something if the printed numerals could be trusted. The 5 was smeared into a 2 or a 3. Her brain supplied the missing circle because that's what brains do when a story is half told. The tear edge would fit the absence she'd stared at on a kitchen table with a shell weighing the top sheet. The page Roker had torn out and taken with him. It had come back. Shaw looked over her shoulder out of reflex. No one on the path. No figure at the door. No print on the wet rock but the one she had laid down now and last night. The herringbone of her boot, heel nick, the scuff where she'd slipped and told no one. She held the paper at a slant to the thin light. The words had been written after the page was wet. The ink lay slick on top of fibers that had already swollen. No feathering where a dry page would drink. The smear across the D read as a finger dragged through while the hand moved the sheet aside. The dot after done was too forceful for punctuation. It was a nail. The C licked at the ledge once, as if to make sure she knew it still existed, then fell back with the long patience of creatures that don't hurry for mammals. Shaw slipped the page into a clean mylar sleeve from her kit, expelled the air, and heat-sealed the edge with the lighter she told herself was for rope and found other uses for. The sleeve fogged, then cleared. The words kept their shape as if relieved to be allowed to. She could put it on the log. She could call in a uniform and have him hold the plastic by its corners and swear to where and when. She could bag it with a label in her tidy hand. BWPLH/ledge/N page. 532. Found beneath seam a runout. She could be the sort of inspector who believes that if you make a miracle stand still in front of a clerk long enough, it becomes a form. Instead, she slid the sleeve under the hardboard of her notebook and closed the covers as if tucking a child in on a night the house was listening. On the way back up, the constable asked if there was anything to report. Just weather, she said, and he accepted the lie because he wanted to, and because lying about weather is a right reserved to natives and working detectives. At the station, the kettle made its domestic noise and the lab's email arrived like paperwork always does, without a sense of theater. Confirmatory DNA results consistent. Marine microlife profiles match previously reported depth signature. No exogenous anticoagulants detected. She read the words, filed them where they belonged, and left another where it didn't. Not done. To sit under her palm and heat the bone behind the skin like a small, practical fever. She compared the letters properly at her desk with the photograph of the rub from the B&B. The cross-strokes were the same meanness. The habit of pressing hardest at the start of A and lifting early to starve the tail. Identical. The way his E refused the bottom bar unless he reminded it. Even the small shamefaced dot. A thing he'd written after he'd learned it was polite to put a full stop and never quite trusted the instruction. Had the same placement. Too close to the last letter, mean as a tip. The match would hold in court, if she ever let it see one. A call came from county, all concern and certainty. We've reviewed your preliminary. Given the conditions, given the absence of any evidence for third-party involvement, given the rugged terrain, you understand our thinking. Mr. Roker's death, the official pause to pick a word out of a dish, is likely an accidental fall in proximity to the foreshore. Shaw looked at the mylar under her notebook and felt the comfortable, drafted language lie in the room. Understood, she said. And the reports regarding unusual staining? Rust, she said. Salt and rust. A breath like relief. Of course, we appreciate your thoroughness. We'll coordinate with your office on next of kin for personal effects. I'll send you what we have, Shaw said, and put the phone down like a person closing a drawer. She sent the tidy version. Maritime claims investigator James Roker deceased by misadventure. Body recovered with injuries consistent with fall into water. Evidence of historic smuggling operations beneath Blackwater Point Lighthouse forwarded to appropriate agencies. No further action recommended folklore reports. She did not type not done. She did not attach a photograph of letters written on a wet page by a dead man's hand that should not have been where she found it. The mylar sat under the notebook, the words fogging briefly when her coffee's steam slipped under the cover and made a weather system in paper. She pulled it out and looked again. The phrase seemed to be speaking to itself, not to her. Not done. Roker's ledger in his own stubborn voice. The way men tell their work what it isn't allowed to be yet. Maybe not, she said to the room. She slid the sleeve into her bag, behind the pocket with the spare gloves and in front of the place her badge slept at night. In the afternoon, the coroner sent a line with the shape the county call had predicted. Drowning. Contributory blunt trauma. The harbor office posted a notice about path safety and tides. The widow's lantern opened like it always did, and the landlord served pints that tasted like people allowing themselves to be unconvinced. Agnes Palglace, passing Shaw on the lane, touched 2 fingers to her temple like a salute she had invented for women who had gone where men said not to. Shaw filed what could be filed and put away what refused. On her way out, she paused by the pinboard where the duty officer had scribbled black-tied window. Closed and, before she could stop herself, wrote underneath in small, tidy capitals for now and then scowled at her own sentiment and rubbed it out to a faint ghost. Paper remembers when you want it to forget. Stone forgets when you want it to remember. You arrange yourself between and pretend to call it work. By evening the lighthouse stood white and boring against a rinsed sky. The gulls played their game of stealing from each other and calling it fishing. In the lane, a small boy dragged a stick along a fence and hit each upright like a metronome for a town trying not to dream in red. Shaw went home and put the sleeve in the drawer where her passport should have been and wasn't. She locked the drawer and made tea and didn't drink it. The page lay in the dark and did not change its words. Authorities closed the case as accidental death. Part 20 after the storm. Truro HQ had the light you give to things you don't want to think about twice. Bluish, tireless, politely exhausting. Shaw returned her kit, signed the courier manifests that had waited like dogs, and typed the version of events that could live inside a file. The incident summary acquired its varnish. Roker, James, deceased by misadventure. No evidence of third-party involvement. Terrain hazardous. Conditions poor. A paragraph below, in the register's tidy voice, historic evidence of illicit storage at Blackwater Point Lighthouse forwarded to appropriate agencies. She added one more line, middle of the page where no one would notice unless they had to. Item of interest, brass compass, suspected to be present at site. Not recovered. The keyboard accepted the lie as if it had a policy on such things. She put the key to the evidence locker back on its peg and watched it hang there and tell her nothing. The superintendent wanted a corridor version. "We've taken a few calls," he said, leaning against the door jamb as if it were a habit, not a pose. "Coast Guard, county, and a woman who runs a pub that seems to run the town. Tell me it's over." "It's over," Shaw said. "For now." He heard the second bit and chose to file it under color. That was his talent and his curse. Down at Blackwater Point, the council sent a man with a clipboard to inventory the cottage. A kettle, a bed, a logbook missing 2 pages, a drawer of gaskets and wicks. 2 days later, a letter on serious paper arrived at HQ. "I resign my post with immediate effect," it said, in a hand that never learned to flourish. "Thank you for the employment given." No forwarding address. No bank details. A signature that might have been Thomas Grigg if Grief had learned calligraphy and given up. By the time the clerk took a pool car to collect the keys, the cottage was open and empty, the bed made, no bread in the tin. Grigg had left the same way his father had. Light out, latch drawn, as if rooms were a tide you stepped back from. A month up the calendar, an agency keeper with a haircut that trusted automation walked through the tower with a checklist and a smile. Trinity men, once gods, now techs who knew how to sweet-talk lenses and alarms. He ran diagnostics and patted metal and said, "She's sound," to the duty constable as if he were discussing a horse, then posted a cheerful notice on the harbor board. Routine maintenance completed. Lighthouse operational. Public reminded cliff paths are dangerous in inclement weather. The word routine did a lot of work. Locals, who don't read notices unless they tell of funerals or fates, took their weather in the true way. At the window pane, in the set of gulls' wings, in the way seaweed dries crooked on the wall. The black tide window came and went without spectacle. No red on the tower. No 7 minutes. The pub's talk shifted, not to something else, but away from something it had been rehearsing for years. Agnes Palglace drank her tea with 2 slices of lemon and said, when asked by a woman from upcountry whether the lighthouse bled here, "Not in a manner you need to know about," and smiled a thin, provincial smile that sounded like a gate latch. Harry Tregear rolled a cigarette he didn't light and let his eyes not quite leave the tower. "No one wants to believe in quiet," he said to no one in particular, and in that small sentence was the entire method of the town. Shaw worked the ordinary because that is what days are for. A burglary ring whose courage had outpaced its intelligence. A squabble that started in a car park and ended in A&E with 7 stitches and 3 different versions of the truth. She filed. She drove. She checked the time left on a boil-washed life. Nights, she would open the drawer where her passport wasn't and take out the mylar sleeve containing Roker's wet page. Not done. The words didn't change their grammar. They didn't need to. She put it back each time as if tucking something in that didn't sleep. Crace from North Atlantic phoned once more. "Our files hate gaps," he said, a little wryer for the month. "If a compass resurfaces in a catalog." "It won't," Shaw said. "And if it does? Then you never called me," she said, and he accepted the absolution men in his trade understand. A brown paper parcel turned up 3 weeks later. No return address. The Penzance franc blurred like breath on glass. It lay on the duty desk with the morning's post as if it were a renewal notice for a dog license. The constable looked at the scrawl and said, "For you," with that mixture of curiosity and gratitude people have when danger has chosen a different desk to visit. Inside the outer paper, a small wooden box, the sort jewelers use when a purchase needs to feel like an heirloom. No maker's name. The hinge was cheap but new. The lid creaked with the effort of being asked to do something important. She opened it along a fault line of dread and duty. Inside, on black felt that had ideas above its station, lay a piece of brass as thin as a letter opener and shaped like the idea of a spiral. Two arms turned inward toward each other and met like disagreements. Its edges had been honed to a fraction, as if meant to fit into a slot that hadn't been visible until you were told it existed. A faint ropework pattern ran the outer curve. On one end, scratched with some impatient thing, a mark 379, the number she had photographed on the compass's underside, reduced until they had to be reckoned with by hand. Shaw did not touch it at first. She looked at it the way you look at an animal you can't name. The object was not decorative. It was a key or a wedge or a missing part of a machine that had decided it preferred to be superstition. When she set two fingers to it, the warmth that had left the compass visited her through the metal, small, unseasonal. She thought of Grig. It burned like a coin from a hearth. She thought of Armitage. Expect the weather to read the indictment first. She thought of her watch, dull on the desk, an everyday machine that had never hurt anyone because it never had an idea. There was no letter in the box, no note, only, on the underside of the lid, a smear of salt dried to a fine bloom, as if a hand that had learned to live with brine had shut it without thinking. She bagged the sliver and noted the parcel, now property of CID. Blackwater in her tidy capitals, then sat with the strangeness and let it find its level. Not recovered, she had written. And yet here the case had sent something small enough to keep and sharp enough to cut between how she explained things and how she knew them. Outside, the sky had that wrung-out look that Cornwall makes a dish of. She lifted her wrist and glanced at her watch. Said what watches say. Kept good time because it had been designed to be believed. She set the brass sliver beside it and watched the seconds hand argue with nothing. Nothing argued back. She put the lid on the box until the hinge remembered it was cheap, then set the parcel on the shelf where difficult evidence waits for a better day. On her way out, she passed the pin board and the duty note about path safety. Someone, bored, unhelpful, had drawn a spiral in the corner with a biro while waiting for the phone to ring. She considered telling them off and didn't. The sea has better ways of disciplining children. At home, she set the box on the table beside the 4 photographs of the compass, the rub from the Finch's manifest, and the Admiralty entry with its quiet, bureaucratic not recovered. She walked to the sink, turned the cold tap, and let the water run just long enough to hear its first, throat-clearing cough. Behind her, the watch on the table ticked like a law being explained to an empty room. Inside, a brass sliver shaped like a spiral. Part 21, The Spiral's Call. The brass sliver waited on her kitchen table like a thought she hadn't decided to think. Outside, Truro put its evening in order. Bins shouldered to curbs, a van reversing with a polite beep, someone upstairs skidding a chair across floorboards and then apologizing to no one. The box's felt had shed a fleck of black onto the metal. Shaw brushed it off with a thumb and the sliver's ropework caught the lamplight and sent it back quieter than it received. Her watch lay beside it, old habit dressed in steel. Nothing special. Screwback case, dull crystal, a face that had been honest with her more days than most people she knew. She turned it over. The backplate had a shallow groove along the edge where a tool fits. She had opened it twice in 8 years to swap a battery under the eye of a teenage clerk whose lanyard had taken its job too seriously. She slipped a case knife in and eased. The back came away with the small pop of a seal remembering air. No mystery waited inside. A coin cell battery, gaskets, a stamped code. But there, off-center, was a recess she had never noticed because she had never needed to. A crescent cut into the plate that protected the works. An eccentric smile the size of a thumbnail. Not an engineer's flourish. A slot. She lifted the watch, tilted it, and the recess answered the sliver's geometry with the intimacy of a photograph recognizing its negative. Don't be ridiculous, she told herself, and then fitted the brass into the curve. It seated with the soft, sure press of a thing going home. Nothing happened. Of course, nothing happened. The second hand lapped the 12 with the bureaucratic good sense of an appliance and went on with its one job. She left the back off, laid the watch crystal down on the felt, and sat back in the chair. The room was warm from the day's steam. The radiator ticked a small, elderly music. She made tea, didn't drink it, and watched the seconds count her toward midnight because sometimes you let a superstition set its table and then refuse to sit. At 23:59, she told herself to get up, to put the brass back in the box, to ring Armitage or throw the sliver into the drawer with passports and dead pens and call it a night's mistake. She stayed seated instead, elbows on the table, the watch face down like a sleeper, the brass hidden in its new mouth. Midnight came on Kat's feet. The microwave's blue numerals rolled and pretended not to notice themselves. Somewhere outside, a fox barked twice like someone coughing in the wrong room. The second hand stopped. Not the lazy stutter of a failing battery. Not the accidental catch of a hand under a sleeve. It halted clean at the 12 as if obeying geometry. Shaw felt the pause in her chest as if her own machine had been told to mind its manners. She turned her head by the smallest angle because the room had changed its idea of itself. The air thickened in a way she knew too well, a harbor's weight, a stairwell's damp, the measurable presence of salt. 1 second, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. On the 8th, the hand moved. The watch exhaled. The room did not. She lifted her head and the gulls arrived. Not outside. Not the ragged daylight clatter she'd learned to tune out. Not the thin, inland cry you hear when weather shoves sea birds up the estuary. Distant, plural, inside the walls like sound piped through old plumbing. A long surf battered a cliff in another room. The radiator ticked along, pretending not to hear. She flipped the watch and it was only a watch again. Hands minding time, the glass reflecting her cheekbone and the crooked bent of a lampshade she hadn't noticed was crooked. She turned it over. The brass sliver sat where she'd put it, not graven, not welded, not mystical, just married to a recess that had been waiting without knowing it was waiting. Her flat smelled of iron, not sharp, like fresh cut, warm, like a coin palmed. It threaded through the clean smells. Tea, dust, the tired flowers a constable had brought back from a community fete because he thought the station needed cheering, and she had rescued them before they embarrassed themselves. She stood, ridiculous in her own kitchen, and looked for the thing you always look for when something changes a room. The spill, the leak, the hidden pan left on low. There was none. The window was closed. The world was as it had been 10 minutes ago, except that somewhere the Atlantic had rolled itself down a long corridor and found her address. She put the watch to her ear. The tick was the same. Her own breath had gone quiet as if not to disturb a bird. She left the watch face up and crossed to the untrustworthy wardrobe mirror in the hall. The glass had warped years ago. It threw her back at herself with a thin kindness she didn't merit. She put her palm to the cool, smoked surface. In it, behind her shoulder, the kitchen door sat square. Beyond, the table. On the table, the watch. On the watch, the sliver in the back where a sliver had no business. Nothing else. No red. No veils. No men under water learning to be names. Enough, she said aloud, and the mirror kept her confidence. On the way back to the table, she saw them for a second. The faintest bloom of salt crystals making lace along the metal rim of the watch back where it touched the brass. They caught the lamplight and showed it back as frost. When she bent close and blew, they did not vanish. She slid a fingernail over one, and it parted with the brittle sting of winter. Her phone, face down, thrummed once as if a message had reached it from a room without reception. Shaw glanced. No alert. No banner. Just the polite, empty face phones make when they want you to think they contain nothing you can be accused of knowing. She set its screen down again, and the radiators, having finished whatever point they had been making, fell quiet. She thought of Roker's page in its sleeve, the stubborn capitals saying not done like a man barking orders at his own handwriting. She thought of Agnes tapping her temple to mark some small salute that might have been for sailors or women who didn't flinch. She thought of Griggs' hands flat on a table the color of old tea, the muscles along the jaw that had decided to become stone. She thought of the cave and its habit of breathing through the stairwells of men's houses. The watch ticked. The second hand reached the 12 and did not dare stop this time. The room eased its shoulders. She prized the sliver out. 2 fingernails under the inside curve. A twist. The small reluctance of a thing invited and now dismissed. She set it back in the jeweler's box on its vein felt. The iron smell thinned as if someone had opened a window in a room she could not see. She wiped the watch back with the hem of a dish towel, and the salt crystals came away on the weave like sugar. She screwed the back on. The gasket seated. The case knife clicked into the drawer beside a passport that wasn't there. When she lifted her wrist to refit the strap, the watch's face caught the ceiling light, and for a second the glass went red, and then it didn't, and she told herself it had never done any such thing. She fastened the buckle. The leather remembered her. On the table, the box sat small and mannered. If she closed it, the hinge would creak. She left it open because leaving things ajar is how you keep your own lies honest. The brass curled on the felt and did not cool further. She thought she could hear gulls again, low, then decided she could not. She switched the lamp off and the flat became lines and suggestion. Night took the white out of the walls. Somewhere a drain said a long, far-off ah. She lay on the bed without undressing, shoes on the mat like a pair of polite animals. The watch ticked on her wrist, suddenly louder for having learned to stop. In that between time before sleep came to offer its cheap compromises, she heard it one more time. A slow, gathered surf striking rock, followed by the hush of retreat. Not outside, not in memory, in the room, in the air between ceiling and floor, between lungs and throat. 7 seconds is nothing until you have counted them once. Shaw turned her face toward the window. There was no sea to see. There was only the suggestion of a roofline and the idea of weather. She closed her eyes and, because habit is a kind of prayer, put her fingers to the pulse at her wrist and counted. The watch kept the count. The world, temporarily, agreed. When the narrator arrived, he did not enter through the door. He came in the way old stories do, through the objects people use to pretend they are safe from distance. He did not clear his throat. He did not ask the house's permission. His voice was the one the program used when the night had already decided how it wanted to end. They say the sea remembers every debt and every debtor, he said, somewhere between the kitchen and the part of the head where worry hums. Some tides wait for the moon, some don't, and some... The pause was a kind hand turning a page you didn't want to get to yet. Some tides don't wait for the sea. The lamp across the street went out. The watch on her wrist made a brave little sound and went on. You've been listening to Somnolent Conspiracies, where every shadow hides a story, and every story leaves a shadow behind. If the sea has taught us anything tonight, it's that some tides are not made of water, and they rise whether we want them to or not. Until our next voyage into the strange and the unseen, keep your lights burning, your doors locked, and your mind